And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room waiting tonight already. Of course, I am joined tonight by the lovely Miss Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I guess it was election mania.
Was still going on.
Well, don't worry. Don't you know it takes at least a month to count votes? That's totally normal. Happens all the time, starting in 2020 anyway. So this is some weird action there. They won't really know what happened, but what we do know for sure is that the Republicans didn't get the route of the Democrats that they were looking for. And there's a lot of unusual factors involved with that, but it's just the actual control of the apparatus of the media which brought a lot of this home. In fact, there were a number of very interesting Republican victories, but a lot of very unusual, like very close calls going on. And, I think that in light of everything that was happening, for the Democrats to maintain anything with this incredibly terrible economy, inflation, foreign policy, and the other junk is just quite remarkable. Indeed, shall we say, would be, shall we say, unexpected, but nonetheless, they're set to lose control of Congress for sure, and maybe the Senate. So that's a good thing, not because, we want to just be Republicans, but because the Democrats in this case have flouted the Constitution so horribly for the 2 years in power that, both parties are showing that independence is the way to go. But right now, the Republicans as a group still have the Constitution to rely on. But of course, we say Republicans very loosely because people like Liz Cheney and other people, Mitch McConnell, are also Republicans. So, this is a very, very unusual piece. One of the things that came out of it, which is interesting, is this DeSantis-Trump feud, which is kind of like a mafia feud. And of course, the Democrats love that. So probably as soon as possible, they should decide which one's going to run. And given DeSantis's age, my suggestion for that party would be Trump is the one with the base. He should run, and then DeSantis should run after him. And a lot of people think, well, the cases will take down Trump, this whole thing about the National Archives and all the rest. Regardless of who you want to win, those guys are going to end up splitting the vote if they don't work that out. So there's lots and lots of billions involved. I have heard a lot of people talking about the presidential election in such a way and saying, well, it doesn't matter, only your local elections matter. And I understand that thinking of creating the foundation, but it doesn't actually work in the real world scenario. Politically, that would be like having, the torso all set, but a headless body going in. I mean, it does not compute, as it were. You need the top of the chain and you need the rest of it. So you need the presidency for sure. And, your local sheriff's not going to save you from radical policies. You need that presidential power in there to create the proper type of balance. And hopefully we get it. And as long as the person involved is involved in swearing to the Constitution, we don't have any problems. But if they aren't, then there's major problems. And we've seen most of these guys don't. Right now, we have definitely brain dead leadership. And we have real problems. We've got problems with Biden because he can't even pull it off in public anymore. I mean, he always had problems with it, but I think it's gone into a new stage. So there's lots of politics swirling about. There was this, of course, FBI raid on this UFO site, this Dreamland site. And I've still been getting details about that.
Was he arrested, or was it just a raid and I know they took computers and... Yeah,
the idea was files. That this was somebody who supposedly kept an eye on Area 51. But again, we don't even know if any of that is related to Area 51, like the Bob Lazar thing turned out to be not related at all to it. Now, I wouldn't put it past the government to do that for someone who's dropping in on their work. so we're going to have to wait and see on that one. I didn't like, there were some flashes about this guy hanging out with Corbell and Knapp pumping this thing up. So I don't like that kind of, phony UFO circus crew. I'd rather see real hardcore reports on this thing. We'll see what happens. But nonetheless, it's interesting. I would have to say that, this is part of the new policy, right? I mentioned that in May, they had the Department of Homeland Security involved in that big UFO hearing, and something that came up from the Darren LaHood, who's the congressman from Illinois. He was sitting there saying, well, how can we punish those amateur interest groups? Well, maybe this is the start of the punishment of the amateur interest groups by Biden's domestic terrorism wing. I was reading about the Truth Cops there. Leaked documents outline Department of Homeland Security's plan to police disinformation. This is a disastrous piece, which I had planned to get into last week, but I'm putting this aside for a full-on disinformation throttle coming up later this month. But I will say that, in the article, which came out on The Intercept last week, and it's pretty good, actually, I'm very shocked that The Intercept is running this, because, of course, they were supposed to be a fantastic journalistic, a piece headed up by Glenn Greenwald and all that. And then they got so woke that even he, who founded it, jumped out. That's pretty bad.
Did he jump out, or was he forced out?
No, he couldn't deal with them anymore after they blocked the laptop, the Hunter Biden laptop story. And that was the great, basically every journalist who went along with that should all quit. They should go get jobs at anywhere where you're paid to be a yes man, because those are just paid off stories at that point. And I do feel like it's very important on the journalism side, when we look at this, that with the elections going forward, that the 2024 election is going to be very important. And we have to get the independent voice right in the middle of things right off the bat. And, they're going to try to silence the independent voice using some of these Department of Homeland Security tools. One of the things that came out is that the work, much of which remains unknown to the American public, came into clearer view earlier this year when the Department of Homeland Security announced a new disinformation governance board. We remember this, and Nina and our friend. So while the board was widely ridiculed, immediately scaled back, and then shut down within a few months, other initiatives underway at DHS, they're already moving forward on it. So that was just the public trial balloon, and then they retreated. Other initiatives are underway as the Department of Homeland Security pivots to monitoring social media now that its original mandate, the war on terror, has been wound down. Oh, so they're just going to, now we are Al-Qaeda, basically, and they're keeping their eyes on us. This is the nature of the problem. This is the nature of this administration, the unlawful surveillance of average citizens. And that UFO story is actually a great example, because they opened the door in that May hearing that amateur interest groups, that is, people who are interested in the subject, should be penalized somehow for confusing it because they couldn't get the UFO threat thing out directly from the Central Intelligence Agency through the media. There's this problem. There's a corridor there of independent people looking into it themselves. And some of them are very, very talented. Behind closed doors and through pressure on private platforms, the U.S. government has used its power to try to shape online discourse. According to meeting minutes and other records appended to a lawsuit filed by the Missouri Attorney General Eric Schmidt, there's a name for you, who is also running for Senate, discussions have ranged from the scale and scope of government intervention in online discourse to the mechanics of streamlining takedown requests for false and intentionally misleading information. In other words, I come forward with a hot story, and they're able to get it down, touchdown, very quickly, so that it doesn't hang out and people don't hear about it beforehand. And, we had an interesting example of that this week, because I ran the Jim Marrs interview from the late Jim Marrs. This is very interesting, too, because Jim, he was always ahead of the curve by a long shot. And so that video that we did, now going back to 2016, was pulled down on so many platforms that I had just given up on it. But I put it up on Rumble, because we started a Rumble channel, not to replace what we're doing here, but just as a backup for any reason. And you know, it was great to have people over there checking it out. But that video now had been censored on multiple platforms. Now it's out again. So whatever it was in there that bothered them, I always suggest Jim's work around major deep events like 9/11, the JFK assassination, and others. So that one was kind of another example of, oh, when we've been hit by the censorship. And I don't talk about it a lot because, you know, I think when you do this kind of work, you're not there to be a victim and say, well, you know, the deep state flattened my tire. We've had enough of that. But I think what I do want to point out is I object to the concept fundamentally that in America you can control journalism. It's just, you know, the exact opposite of what America is all about. So the free speech aspect is crucial. You know, the First Amendment is the First Amendment for a reason. So, you know, you can't, there's no playing with that. That's a constitutional issue. We're here to stay. And it's, you know, if the Biden administration wants to call it misinformation, you know, that's just part of their political rancor. It has nothing to do with reality, and they just want things that agree with them. So we're going to continue to do it, and we will find so many more channels under that kind of censorship pressure. So, you know, my suggestion is follow the Constitution on that one, and we're going to continue to push that. And when we see examples of people being shut down, we're gonna bring notice of it. You know, we're going to bring it into the spotlight. So take that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Now, here we are. It's X Series 139, and we're going to go deep tonight into the mystery schools in America. Now, what happened was we're doing it through the lens of G.I. Gurdjieff, who their attempt to bring over the fourth way schools to America and all of the different obstacles that they encountered, but the incredible results and the kind of legacy that we're sitting on as a result of all this. All pieces into what we're doing in this episode. Some very interesting stories about Gurdjieff and Ouspensky's trips over here to America to set up a new kind of mystery school that was public and something that people in the culture could be injected with. This is the same mission of the Theosophical Society, the Anthroposophical Society. They all had this goal in mind of creating the public mystery school, and those mystery schools then had a chance through them to use them as a conduit to bring this incredible information relating to our ancient past, relating to psychic abilities, relating to very deep esoteric information, so that we could move the culture in a direction in terms of consciousness, in terms of spirituality, in terms of political policy, fairness, and everything else. So we're looking at a very sweeping vision, and these schools attempting to do that. And in the case of the Gurdjieff School, I can tell you the story is one of the most unusual of all, and we're going to enjoy going over that tonight. We've done some shows on the fourth way before, but the fourth way in America is a very interesting piece that goes along with this, and the introduction of the ENNEAGRAM factors into that as well. I want to remind everyone that we're going to be taking questions in the second part of the program. So you can ask Miss Olivia for those, and we'll be off and running with that. How are we doing over there?
Doing great. Kate Schneider had a good line. The Biden-Fetterman 2024, it's a no-brainer.
That's great. Yeah, I was going to say, hey, Fetterman, right? You know, there you go, President Fetterman. And, you know, this is just part of the kind of the joke of the situation, which is people are such puppets in the front that they don't need the ability to think, apparently. They just need the handlers in the background, and they stand up there and whatever. You know, people made a lot of fun of Fetterman. Look, it's not his condition. It's the fact that he can't do the job that's required. That's what's going on there. It's not making fun of his handicap. It's making fun of the idea that this guy could handle any kind of, you know, he couldn't even handle a debate with Dr. Oz, who I thought was a terrible candidate. I did not think it was a good idea for them to run Oz. And, you know, it was hard to get behind Oz as well. So the whole thing, Pennsylvania was a mess, let's face it. So what I do suggest is that they have a major program in 2024 to win the state. as part of the Republican ticket because the Democrats are doing absolutely terrible things there. What else you got?
Najat Madri, what is the point if they can control the outcome of the election? Elections have become more of a survey and backdoor deals.
Well, yeah, absolutely. We need, first of all, I think we should do everything with paper ballots. That would solve a lot of problems, in fact. In terms of tabulation, it's a much easier way to double check what's going on. I know from my own knowledge of, the technical side of computers and everything else. I edited a tech magazine for 10 years. I have that background to understand how easy it is to manipulate it. And, two of the factors that came out of this election that really were bothersome to me is that older people in their 70s, and younger people in their 20s, were both overwhelmingly on the same side as the mainstream media. That's very disturbing because I see these groups on two opposite ends, and the older group was being fed all this stuff about like, well, save democracy and all this nonsense. I mean, the Democrats are anything but for democracy. Give me a break. And on the younger side, they were being sold this idea that, hey, you're going to get your student loans paid for. You have to vote. And they did. And then
immediately,
well, the problem is they took that money from the taxpayers, you and I, and basically did that as a favor, to get some votes. I mean, that is basically what you do when you want to persuade a group. You pay them off, but they're paying them off with our money. And trust me, this is the same group that wants to get rid of the legacy of your parents paying into the Treasury, paying into Social Security, paying into all these different things. They want to get rid of that. So you're supporting the wrong people. And I think that we need to have a big, long conversation with people in their 20s about the realities of politics and not this ridiculous CNN joke or like some TikTok version of it. You need the real thing. You need a real history. This is the deep state you're talking about. This is the Central Intelligence Agency manipulating the media. You have to be aware of these corporate structures. And if you're just voting for your student loans, then you're going to lose America, and that's a big deal. So we'll get into that. Maybe we'll figure out some way to have dialogues with those groups of voters, because I think that's a major piece for people to be on the same page in relation to that. And I was absolutely flabbergasted reading the stats. And I mean, it's not Republican or Democrat, because largely the position we take is independent, but you have to respect the Constitution. So if the entire DNC is, showing contempt for the Constitution, then they're the party that needs to get thrown out. And in fact, they are getting thrown out, but not in the numbers that they should be thrown out. And I think that that's the kind of illness between the media and the establishment that we're looking at here. It's too much control in too small of a group of hands. And, we're watching that in relation to the technocracy. They are getting very, very deeply on the Democrat side. It's too close for comfort. And so we need that balance, and we need the two parties, but we need a third party, powerful right in the middle, to grow out of all this, for sure. Not that I think we should have a big third party candidate in the upcoming election, because I think that would give the Democrats a chance to, run some joker like Gavin Newsom or somebody like that. Woo. I mean, it's one thing to kind of keep that in California, but my God, we can't have that spread to the rest of the country. And they should boot him in California. The great, wonderful people of California deserve something a heck of a lot better than Gavin Newsom, let me tell you. But that was the election, everyone. So very interestingly, I can tell you there's a political connection to this show as well, because we know at heart the mystery schools are fundamentally intertwined with the political process, so much so that Rudolf Steiner, in talking about the mystery schools, said that when Helena Blavatsky got to America in 1875 in New York and had reached out to all of these mystery schools, she found they were all deeply, deeply rooted in the political process. And that was in 1875. So, it's 150 years later. How much more has that influence grown? And of course, mystery schools and secret society, they come in various stripes. So the mystery schools that we're referring to, theosophy, the Gurdjieff work, anthroposophy, that wave, that thread of the Western initiators is something that's set up there by these ancient groups to move the culture forward and to let these concepts out to move the culture forward. Side by side with it is the whole left-hand path of these secret societies using the same tactics and the same kind of knowledge, but for a totally cross purpose. And so that's where we get into trouble with so many of the dark groups. And I think that we're looking at a lot of black magic groups that really took a lot of control in America. And this is the clash. And part of what I see with the block for so many of these groups, like anthroposophy and the Gurdjieff work in America, they had tremendous problems. And I think that is part of that walling off. It's like, stay out of this zone kind of thing. But there are some good ones here too. So, it's all a balance. But interestingly enough, in the early development of the fourth way, Gurdjieff, who was the Greek Armenian mystic who set up this work for the harmonious development of humanity, this group received a very interesting person in the 1920s who was struggling with this degenerative disease. And he was a major political figure who wanted to stay anonymous. Well, this was FDR. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who sought out Gurdjieff and his healing techniques when he was at the Priory in France. And of course, we all know the story of Edgar Cayce giving the readings to Woodrow Wilson for the famous 14 points that were to kind of create a whole new League of Nations and this thing. And ultimately, that didn't come to pass, but Cayce was there and gave the readings. He also gave readings for Woodrow Wilson because Wilson had suffered a stroke while in office. And, fundamentally, Cayce got called to the White House under very secretive circumstances. We've only found out in retrospect. But we've had this influence around it. Henry Wallace, the vice president under FDR, very, very deep theosophist, working with a very, very interesting esoteric branch inside theosophy. And also doing very interesting things like putting the original American seal back on the dollar. That's where we get the pyramid and the third eye. Well, if you go back even to the 1920s, it wasn't back on there. It took Henry Wallace being the VP and getting this whole thing going. And he was set up to become president. He was going to be, in fact, President X, because he was very aware of the X steganography, and he was going to be that esoteric president. But at the last minute, really, in 1944, after he'd been VP for 4 years, and he had scheduled a series of readings with Cayce as well. There's someone who was assisting Cayce named Harmon Brough, who set up the readings that were going to take place in early 1945. And in fact, Henry Wallace would not end up being VP anymore. But Cayce died in January of 45 in any case. But it is fascinating. They're aware on that level of this. We've already shown the influence of Gene Dixon on Reagan and Nixon. And we've seen that very interesting thread of New Thought through the President Trump and Trump's uncle and that whole Tesla piece with Vannevar Bush in the background there. There's a very compelling connection with all this. Now we've seen General Flynn is very closely associated with the Church Universal, Summit Lighthouse, Elizabeth Clare Prophet, Ascended Masters, Saint Germain group. That is very interesting. And along with it, the Steve Bannon connection to the Gurdjieff Fourth Way groups is also very interesting. The study that takes place there. Now, I can say this in terms of the Gurdjieff work, it was not aimed at politics. It was aimed at people on the ground and transforming them, giving them the tools to transform. And it was a little bit different than Theosophy and some of the other kind of more fantastical movements that were taking place. It did not rely on a kind of psychic contact or ascended masters and things of this nature. It relied more on kind of, you could say, these techniques that existed inside the mystery schools and were brought forward through exercises that would help perfect the individual. And then you have a larger cosmology attached with it that in various stages they would come along and develop. One of the things that happened with Theosophy is that, it lent itself, because of the general fantastic nature of what they were letting out, it lent itself to people's imaginations. So suddenly it wasn't just Blavatsky who was interacting with this group, the Masters of Wisdom. You had, people just kind of running off on their own and saying like, well, I communicated with Kuthumi and here's my book, and then you'd have a division going off and following them, and then they turn against Blavatsky and on it went. I guess this is really how the developments of religions go as well. You have those splinter groups. But in the case of the Gurdjieff work, in fact, it incorporates a lot of Theosophy more than it would care to credit. This group, Gurdjieff's teaching coming in, first he comes into Russia, and that's where he meets P.D. Ouspensky. And Ouspensky is already somebody who's well celebrated through his book Tertium Organum, which is absolutely fascinating overview of very esoteric concepts, and brings in something that when it gets translated in and is available in the UK and in America, it takes off. It's a bestseller, in fact, because no one's ever read anything about this. This is somebody who's kind of a rising star. And Ouspensky, he goes around and takes a trip, and he goes to India and he goes to the Far East, and he's looking for these schools. He's like, I don't just want to talk about the mystery schools. I want to be in one. And he's a journalist at the time, and having a very interesting time with his book being out. And he's had a number of psychic experiences his whole life, as well as a very strong sense of recurrence. That is, that he's lived this life before. And he'll write a novel, in fact, called The Strange Life of Ivan Ossikin, which is basically a Groundhog Day script there. And interesting, as I've noted when I did the last Fourth Way show, that Bill Murray is a very major, he was very, very into the Gurdjieff work. So it's interesting they selected him for the Groundhog Day. I'm sure that film got made as a result of him angling to get it on. But Ouspensky's fundamental proposition was that there was something missing from our traditional way of looking at the world, and we were missing this spiritual dimension. And his work really played closely with Theosophy. But what happened is, when he came across Gurdjieff's work, Gurdjieff kind of overshadowed him and gave him basically a master in person, in flesh and blood. This wasn't an ascended master. This was a guy who'd been through the training in the mystery schools and came out. And so Ouspensky felt this was an extraordinary meeting. And I have a couple of things that he said in relation to that meeting that I think kind of sum it up quite well. And one of the things that they brought forward in this whole creation of the Fourth Way schools are concepts that were completely non-existent over here and that we didn't understand. This whole thing about the series of eyes, super efforts, man's essence, the Enneagram, none of this was anywhere. This is a completely original and unusual teaching. And though I think there are links through theosophical ideas, alchemical, hermetic ideas, and even Buddhism, there's something totally original and bizarre about this. And the fundamental concept is that humanity is asleep and therefore acting in a mechanical fashion. And if they didn't wake up, they'll never achieve their spiritual evolution. And it went into such great details and had such a great sweep of knowledge that, Gurdjieff's early work can be seen as just very pure, pristine. There's no handbook for it. There's no bestseller. There's nothing. There's just Gurdjieff coming out and teaching this in groups. He adopts Ouspensky. Ouspensky works very closely to become his pupil and asks him very kind of deep questions and says, how can I become your disciple on all this? And Gurdjieff says, look, I'll take you on as a pupil, but the only condition that I have is that I want you to take, a pledge not to reveal any of this stuff until you've learned it all, so don't blurt out in articles and things like that until you've really taken on the training. And Ouspensky, in his turn, says, well, I'll do that, but my condition for you is that I can say all of it. I don't have to hold anything back. I want to be able to say everything that I've learned. And so they both agree, and off they go. Interestingly enough, Gurdjieff is so impressive that although Ouspensky is the one who's more established in the world, he cedes the teaching aspect to Gurdjieff. And Gurdjieff says to him, well, your book, Tertium Organum, is amazing. And if I thought that you understood everything in your own book, I'd bow down to you as a master. But you don't understand either what you read nor what you're writing. And this was very compelling, because it was almost an insult, but it was also intriguing. And you could tell that Gurdjieff wanted and had targeted out Ouspensky to bring forward his message. And there's a whole series of very unusual things where Ouspensky is working actually at a Russian newspaper, and he keeps seeing this thing come up. It's a show advertisement for something called The Struggle of the Magicians. And The Struggle of the Magicians is basically like the Theater de Mystery schools. It promises to be this ballet that reveals all these esoteric truths. It's never made. It never happens. But Gurdjieff keeps advertising this thing, and it sort of seeps into the unconscious of Ouspensky, who's looking at this and saying, what is this Struggle of the Magicians? And then later, he runs across someone who's a sculptor, says, I'm working with this Russian mystic, and he's doing a ballet called Struggle of the Magicians. And so all of this kind of in a synchronistic fashion opens up a world for Ouspensky, and he feels, look, he's just come back from the East. He spent all this time. He didn't find anything. He was like, where are all the teachers? Where's all the mystery schools? What's going on here? He comes back to Moscow, and boom, the whole thing is there for him. Here is how Ouspensky describes his first meeting with Gurdjieff. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight on the fourth way teaching and Mystery School America. What happens when Gurdjieff and Ouspensky get to America? I'm going to go take a deep dive in this for you. Here's Ouspensky. I remember this meeting very well. We arrived at a small cafe in a noisy, though not central street. I saw a man of Oriental type, no longer young, with a black mustache and piercing eyes, who astonished me first of all because he seemed to be disguised and completely out of keeping with the place and its atmosphere. I was still full of impressions of the East, and this man with the face of an Indian Raja or an Arab sheik, whom I at once seemed to see in a white burnous or a gilded turban, seated here in this little cafe where small dealers and commission agents met together in a black overcoat with a velvet collar and a black bowler hat, produced the strange, unexpected, and almost alarming impression of a man poorly disguised, the sight of whom embarrasses you because you see he is not who he pretends to be, yet you have to speak and behave as though you did not see it. So here's Gurdjieff, coming in dressed in a kind of a smart suit, sitting there meeting him, and he's like, wait a minute, this guy belongs in a turban, and is obviously some kind of Eastern master. So the other thing is that Gurdjieff speaks Russian incorrectly with a strong Caucasian accent. This basically means he sounds like he's from the Bronx. So he's using this very kind of towny accent. And this accent, with which we are accustomed to associate anything apart from philosophical ideas, strengthens still further the strangeness and the unexpectedness of this impression. So this is the real shoot down for Ouspensky. He's heard all these wonderful things about Gurdjieff, and now he meets him, and it's like, whoa, this guy looks completely out of place. He's bizarre, and he has this Caucasian accent, and it's, he's creating this impression of somebody. So in a way, it's a test. He's almost driving Ouspensky out, because if Ouspensky decides based on this one meeting to just blow him off, then it's not going to happen. So he says, I do not remember how our talks began. I think we spoke of India, of esotericism, and of yogi schools. I gathered that Gurdjieff had traveled widely and had been in places of which I had only heard and which I very much wished to visit. And one of the things that he asks him about is, he has this whole thing about mystery schools. And he asks Gurdjieff, why is it that the mystery schools don't come out and just kind of give us all this information? And what's the function of the mystery schools? And this is part of the answer from Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff says, schools are imperative. First of all, because of the complexity of man's organization, a man is unable to keep watch on the whole of himself. That is, all his different sides. Only school can do this, school methods, school discipline. A man is much too lazy. He will do a great deal without the proper intensity, or he will do nothing at all while thinking he is doing something. He will work with intensity on something that does not need intensity and will let those moments pass by when intensity is imperative. Then he spares himself. He's afraid of doing anything unpleasant. He'll never attain what's necessary, that intensity for himself, by himself. If you have observed yourself in a proper way, you will agree with this. If a man sets himself a task of some sort, he quickly begins to be indulgent with it himself. He tries to accomplish this task in the easiest way possible, and so on. This is not work. In work, only super efforts are counted, and that is beyond the normal, beyond the necessary. Ordinary efforts are not counted. So right away, he's giving him a roadmap of what's going to be required. This isn't going to be, a walk in the park, and you're not just going to show up and chant or meditate or something. You're going to take on the whole work. And the idea of just doing it on your own can kind of get you so far. You're going to get some intellectual ideas and develop a magnetic center for these types of concepts, but you need a school in order to kind of interact on a deeper level with the teaching. Now, here's the interesting thing. What the fourth way does, which was different from other esoteric schools, is it brings a public aspect into the teaching. So you can only, in the regular conditions of everyday life, understand it or apply the concepts. And so what we're looking at with the fourth way is something where if you're a librarian, you stay a librarian. You don't go to a monastery and you don't change the course of your regular life. The fourth way only operates in your actual regular circumstances. And as a matter of fact, one of the other students that Gurdjieff will have, Bennett, who we did a show on previously, J.G. Bennett, he said that a lot of the brothers, a lot of the associates of the schools that he learned of from Gurdjieff were working regular jobs. Like they had jobs as cops, as barbers, and as construction people, whatever it happened to be, they were still in the regular run of everyday life. And so the fourth way could only be applied in regular circumstances. That's interesting. They called it the fourth way because the other three ways, the way of the priest, the way of the fakir, and the way of the monk, all required, staying in a monastery, deep yoga training, whatever it happened to be. The fourth way was something which a person could, in their regular life, develop. This was already conceptually very interesting. Then the heavy emphasis in the fourth way on mechanicalness and how the great industrial revolution was bringing in an age of high-tech machinery and how people were running the risk of just becoming machines. Think of Steiner's concept of Ahriman and that whole piece. So we're looking at something where, there's a lot of things that are in sync in relation to this. When I mentioned J.G. Bennett there, Bennett, who became a very heavy proponent of Ouspensky and Gurdjieff, when he first went to visit Gurdjieff, he was right between working with Ouspensky, Gurdjieff, or Rudolf Steiner. So you see that right at that period of time in the early 20s, there was a kind of a an interesting wave that was happening. It was sort of a post-theosophy wave. Anthroposophy, the Gurdjieff work, the Casey work, all of this stuff was coming into more mainstream parlance and activity. So it's been interesting how these things overlap. One of the main differences, I would say, when you look at these schools is when you get to the Rudolf Steiner work and theosophy, they're dealing with reincarnation. And the fourth way school doesn't rebut reincarnation, but it doesn't use it. Neither does it really use psychic concepts. So, but the work is very mystical, and in fact, it triggers all kinds of psychic activity. So it's interesting the way that they develop it. It's almost like a reaction against the development of theosophy, as if someone back in one of those groups had said, we've done this for 40 years. We've let the theosophy out into the public, and we've run into problems where, theosophy took this turn where they thought they were going to make Krishnamurti into the savior of the world and things of this nature. And so they were like, maybe we'll take a different turn, which is anything that lends itself to mental activity or fantasy and things of this nature, will make work the central focus. We'll make developing yourself and your awareness the central focus. And we'll actually talk about fantasy and psychic activity is almost a negative thing at this level. So it's very interesting what a shock it is. And I think that's what it's designed to do. There's a big piece of the Gurdjieff work, which is all about the shock to the octave and how this shock is part of the developmental evolutionary wave. And it happens in our own interactions as well. It happens in political processes. It happens in economic processes. The Great Depression is probably one of the major shocks. And the downturn of 2008, all the COVID thing, all these things are shocks to the system. And those shocks can take you down and spiral down into a certain direction, or a shock can open things up and take you sprinting off. They run the 50-50 risk with this shock idea. So buried in there is this concept that Gurdjieff brings up about super efforts. I'm going to read this, and so we get a little bit of our heads wrapped around what the teaching is and how they planned to spread it and how that plan got changed or thrown off course. We're shocked. What is meant by super effort? So it's Gurdjieff now. It means an effort beyond the effort that is necessary to achieve a given purpose. Imagine that I have been walking all day and I'm very tired. The weather is bad. It's raining and cold in the evening. I arrive home. I have walked perhaps 25 miles. In the house, there is supper. I've walked at least, half a mile? Pretty good. I arrive home. I've walked perhaps 25 miles. In the house, there is supper. It's warm and pleasant. But instead of sitting down to supper, I go out into the rain again and decide to walk for another 2 miles along the road and then return home. This would be a super effort. While I was going home, it was simply an effort, and this does not count. I was on my way home. The cold, hunger, and rain, all this made me walk. In the other case, I walked because I myself decide to do so. This kind of super effort becomes still more difficult when I did not decide upon it myself, but obey a teacher who at an unexpected moment requires from me to make fresh efforts when I have decided that efforts for the day are over. Another form of super effort is carrying out any kind of work at a faster rate than is called for by the nature of the work. You're doing something, let us say you're washing or chopping wood. You have an hour's work, you do it in a half hour. This is a super effort. So it's an intentional change of consciousness around the thing that you're doing. And instead of seeking for the most kind of efficient and easiest way that you can do it, you actually seek out what's difficult in it. And so there's a lot of different examples of what that might be. Yes.
PV says that my high school football coach taught us how to do super efforts. We won 3 championships in 4 years.
Wow. Were they actually
know about this?
Yeah. Were they related directly to the Gurdjieff work?
Probably not. But they're still super efforts.
Right. Exactly. I think there is something to this, and something opens up on the physical side when this takes place as well. It happens mentally. when you have gone a certain level with an idea and you feel like it's exhausted, there's a strange place that you get into, which opens up a different level of creativity. I've seen a number of songwriters, novelists, and people of that nature also talk about that. And it's not about over rehearsing yourself, or it's not about just winding yourself up in a mechanical fashion. It's like there are a lot of processes that happen where we just kind of hypnotize ourselves to do something. A super effort, I would say, is just the opposite, because you're becoming so aware. You're giving yourself that extra shock that you are reaching a different level of awareness. And once you reach and achieve that level of awareness, things around you start to change as well. It was interesting. There's a series of question and answer that happened with Ouspensky when they asked him, what about world conditions? Are we headed for disaster and things of this nature? And he says, well, when you're doing the work, the actual conditions around you change. Meaning, as you work on yourself, the world starts to change because you're becoming better. That's an interesting place for us to land. I'm going to jump to some comments that Bennett made in relation to this, because he had worked so closely with Gurdjieff at the end of his life. And this is important to me because when you see that World War II has taken place, they've dropped the atomic bomb, the UFO wave has happened, and then Bennett rejoins Gurdjieff in 48 and 49, there's already something going on. And what's very interesting is that Gurdjieff, when he was writing Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, which is this huge opus that he puts out, which is lesser known than Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous, which is so well written and such an incredible overview. And Beelzebub's Tale is like, Ulysses or something. It's a book full of clues that need to be read. But what's fascinating is that Beelzebub is flying his grandson to Earth and telling him different things about Earth. And he's in a spaceship. He's visiting Earth, and he tells him all about Atlantis, and he talks high technology, and he talks that early developmental period of the disaster of Atlantis. I'm going to read some of that tonight as well, and we're going to start to realize just how deep and how modern the Fourth Way experience is for us. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 139, and we're going deep on Mystery School America through the figure of George Ivanovich Gurdjieff and Peter Pyotr Demyanovich Ouspensky. We're going to be taking your questions in the second part of the program. And before I jump away, Miss Olivia, what else you got?
Jordan Banner wants to know, where do we find someone today to learn about esoteric teachings? Where are our schools today? And Forsaken says, who decides which mystery schools are legit? You see tons of people on YouTube claiming that you can buy their books, join their VIP membership, and ascend. I believe mystery school teaching is something, but as far as knowing God's will, etc., I have much doubt.
Well, I mean, it's like any organization of activity. The mystery schools in general aren't public. There are public interfaces, and they've come about through the work of Theosophical Society, the Anthroposophical Society, the work of Edgar Cayce. You've seen other aspects that became like the after effect of that. And so Elizabeth Clare Prophet, the Summit Lighthouse, is an aspect of that. Alice Bailey becomes an aspect of that. But it feels to me like when you get to that level, there's a delusion that takes place. And I've seen this. I don't know why it works that way. But as soon as you get a character like Gurdjieff and a character like Ouspensky, and they put out this amazing thing, and it seems like the next set of thing that they've put into action, that the next set that comes about as a result of this, the next group of people that are teachers, suddenly it all goes downhill. And one of the comments that Gurdjieff made to Bennett in relation to this about the role of mystery schools is what they do is they plant seeds. So they're not meant to be these ongoing, organizations that have tons and tons of followers and foundations all over the world and all this kind of stuff. They're basically meant to plant these seeds, withdraw, see what happens in relation to what they put out there, and then re-engage, moving the culture forward as they do. So they are, by nature obscure. So you're not going to run into a mystery school online. It doesn't happen that way. So I've explained the different levels of what the schools are before. This is a simplification, but you can say there's the actual main mystery school, which is pretty underground. And then as a result of that, you have what they call lesser schools, which have been around since Pythagoras. And they understand, some of what the main mystery schools understand. They have parts of it. They have the philosophy of it. And then you have arcane schools, which follow to the letter things that have been laid down over time and don't try to expand on it and so on. They just are literally for training you on what's already there. And then we have public groups, or private study groups where, people will advertise, do you want to come and study things about Jung? Do you want to come and study things about Gurdjieff? And groups get together and do that. And a lot of us have been through many of those private groups. I know I did a series of them. And on the Gurdjieff side, I became very interested in the differences between the Bennett groups and the Gurdjieff groups and the Ouspensky groups. They're very different, all three. So what I would say there is there is no mystery school that's going to advertise online. And so you're not going to find them that way. However, all of it builds a magnetic center in you. And so that's
Could
worthwhile.
you go into a magnetic center and what you mean by that?
Yes. Well, this is a foundation found inside the Gurdjieff work as well, which is you develop and magnetize to yourself things about certain types of ideas. That's how you grow into this esoteric field of vision. And so what that would be is, when I open up myself to certain types of information, I become interested in it. I go another level with it. It starts to work with me. And so I become kind of in sync with that. And, many of us have found out more doors open as you do that. And things are just almost handed to you as it goes. So there's something which goes beyond just your mind and just your kind of physical interaction with other people around this. There's a deeper level that's involved. What I would say is a lot of that is intuitive, but the ascension type stuff, you have to understand that when you get around, and it's always been there, when you get around this type of work, you are going to be looking at lots and lots of caricatures of the real thing. And that's just the nature, and we've seen it, and we've talked about those groups in this program before. You will find some really hardcore, fascinating information as well. A lot of the information, I've pointed out before, Gigi Young, of course, is a good friend and comes on the show a lot. But if you look at Gigi's information, that's coming from a very mystical point of view. And she has the natural mystic psychic ability. So that makes her particularly good to plug into this kind of history of mystery information. So when she is opening up on that as a mystic, you're getting something very different than somebody who's just hardcore intellectual on it. And, I've had moments in anticipating and contemplating certain types of information where I realize you have to use some other side of your mind in order to comprehend it. It works on a different level than the kind of regular weighing of topics. It's something deeper. And so we do have, thank God, some great people out there who can do this. But I would say that the mystery schools come in waves. And that's really the way to look at it. And I think that they come into the public, they spread those seeds, and then they withdraw and see what happens. So
I'm going to do a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So can you relate that to Edgar Cayce's idea of like attracts like and mind is the builder?
Well, those are absolute concepts. He's describing a universal principle as well, which is, there's a deeper magnetic, energetic exchange on ideas, just like the ideas from and the people that are here. They're here and because, we have something that's in common around these ideas, and we're kind of approaching it from this level. And we both, get a lot. I learned so much from the ideas, hopefully get something from what I'm presenting about this work. So I feel like, like attracts like becomes such a key word in the Casey work, because what he's saying is, the more you open up to the influence, the more you are interrelating with it, the more it's attracted to you. And we've seen this too when it comes to when people talk about great wealth and things of this nature. And, what is that law of attraction woman, the Southern woman?
Catherine Ponder.
Catherine Ponder. This woman had a great understanding of that, and she would relate it down to the most simple of details, that people just had to think a little bit differently, and they were capable of all types of abundance. And I believe a lot of those stories.
There's a lot of defiance in that.
Yes.
Defiance of the circumstances that you are seeing all around you, and you say, no, that is not going to define me. I define my own worth and my own reality, and it doesn't matter what other people are getting, which is so useful right now. Is that, to not look around at what is possible and what is plausible for everybody else and for the world at large, and saying, I will not be satisfied with that.
Exactly.
I am not going to go for those results. I'm going to go for something better.
Well, in the Casey work, it's thoughts are things. And when they asked him specifically, like, how real are thoughts? And he said, as real as a pin in the hand. That's pretty real. So we need to shape the way that we think. And we do need to work on developing the right type of attitude, positive attitude, in relation to these things. But it is fascinating what the mind can do. There's no question about it. And the mind as the builder being the foundation, then we start to wonder, oh, just how powerful is that mind? Very interesting point to ponder. Okay. Bennett, shortly after Gurdjieff's death, trying to, pick up the pieces, puts together a number of different efforts. One of them is Sherborne House, which is a group that gets together with a series of students, and they'll work together for 6 months and put all these pieces into place of the Gurdjieff work, including the movements. And he has all these advisors. Near the end of his life, he's talking about, this is 1974, and he's talking about in 1977 having this whole new version of this set up in West Virginia. Now, a question comes in, and it says, is there a chance of saving the world from disaster? And this is Bennett's response. The old world is past saving. During this present century, remember, they're in the 70s there, the first great disaster has already occurred. This was due to the failure of mankind to recognize the enormous responsibility we incurred through our great technical discoveries, especially the release of energy and through steam internal combustion engines and electrical generators. This release of energy threw the world out of balance. Only conscious people could have rectified it. Now listen closely to this. According to Gurdjieff, there was a group in Tibet that could have saved the world, but their leader was killed by a stray bullet when the British invaded. This group knew the secret of generating the spiritual energies needed to neutralize the destructive forces released by our technical discoveries. Gurdjieff had learned a part of this secret and passed it on to us, Ouspensky and Bennett. It is the answer to his question, what is the sense and significance of human life on this earth? Because of the disaster in 1902, the world collapsed. 2 world wars and the loss of 40 million lives were the visible consequences. The breakdown of human societies with the threat of a 3rd world war were before us in 1950, but strange things happened that averted the final tragedy. Now we must think of saving the new world. We continue to make technical discoveries and release more and more energy. If we succeed in harnessing the energy of atomic fusion, a really frightful situation will arise. The work started in Tibet 100 years ago will have to be resumed on a far greater scale. So Bennett is giving us a very unusual piece about what the fourth way is all about. It is in fact designed to bring about a renaissance in society of conscious awareness of these mystical principles. And it's to head off this incredible disaster that is being unleashed as a result of the fact that the group that was helping us was in Tibet and were basically wiped out. Now, this is interesting because very often when you hear about the Gurdjieff work and all the rest of it, that doesn't come into it. That's a very unusual series of lectures. But Bennett was very close to Gurdjieff. And he had worked with him. He had spied on him in the early 1920s as part of being in British intelligence. And that was in relation to Gurdjieff having all these meetings with a Turkish prince and the Brits wanting to know what was going on here. So in spying on him, he became intrigued by his teaching, and he went to the priory, he met him, and he ended up spending all this time, 20 years, working with Ouspensky. And although he respected Ouspensky incredibly, and I have to say, I think Ouspensky was very mystical and fascinating in his own right, but basically Bennett would come to the conclusion when he got back to Gurdjieff in 1948 that he had wasted 20 years with Ouspensky, when things, 1 year with Gurdjieff was worth 20 with Ouspensky, in relation to this teaching. So that's kind of telling, but we should also keep in mind that people like Krishnamurti, Aldous Huxley, these were students of Ouspensky. So they came to know and to understand the philosophical concepts of Gurdjieff through Ouspensky, who articulated it in a much better fashion. One, he had more command of the language, but two, he also was less provocative. And this is another thing we get to with Gurdjieff. There's a fascinating thing about Gurdjieff's first trips to America, where he really provokes and creates a lot of enemies because he's not playing the kind of kiss up game. And that includes, New York Times editors and stuff. But there's someone named Fritz Peters who wrote a book called Boyhood with Gurdjieff. And I think this is overlooked a lot. This is very interesting. It's actually a 2-book series. And oddly enough, we learned that Henry Miller was very involved with the Gurdjieff work. And it's interesting because Henry gets really swallowed up in a kind of a different type of occult series of groups on the West Coast later in life. But when he's into the Gurdjieff work, he's very interested in what Fritz Peters has to say about it. And I'm going to say this too, that we're going to look at a few figures tonight. P.L. Travers, who wrote Mary Poppins, she was very close with Gurdjieff. And the books, the Mary Poppins books, are very heavily influenced by Gurdjieff. Frank Lloyd Wright, well, he actually worked closely with Gurdjieff to develop an intentional community, a telecine. And his wife was one of Gurdjieff's top teachers. So there's all sorts of interesting threads in the culture where you can see the Gurdjieff work split off into so many different places, just like we see with Steiner and biodynamic farming. And with theosophy, you'll learn things like the first cremation that occurred in America was, as a result of Blavatsky coming over here. That big yoga wave, this is theosophy is opening the doors for that. And there's some great people who open those doors with her. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show Deep Tonight, X Series 139. This is Mystery School America through Gurdjieff Ouspensky and the Fourth Way Secret. We're going to be taking your questions. I almost said calls.
That would be fun.
It's coming. We're going to be taking your questions I'm going to try to get through this stuff, like say in the next half hour. And you can ask those questions now. Miss Olivia is putting those together. Before I get to Fritz Peters and his wonderful anecdotes about Gurdjieff, some of them so fascinating. Miss Olivia.
Spirit Ninja. I read the Fourth Way stuff when I was 17. I misunderstood almost all of it. Really screwed me up. It took me years of meditating study, a bit of ayahuasca, and a year of Rosicrucianism in order to get it right. Joan Q. Public says, is Sufism close or similar to the Fourth Way?
No one ever found out where the Fourth Way came from. It comes from the Sarmung Brotherhood, which is the mystical mystery school that Gurdjieff was a part of, that he had sought out, and he had found maps to and figured out the whole piece that the Sarmung were the ones. Sarmung was a bee symbol, and it meant the keepers of the honey. So this is interesting because that symbol of keeping the honey, preserving the honey, and the bees tending to the beehive, this is what the Sarmoon Brotherhood had as their motto. That's where the Enneagram came out of. And then later, among the Naqshbandi Sufis, they adopt the Enneagram. And so this is interesting because they're obviously connected. And so some people thought, well, Gurdjieff must have worked with the Naqshbandi. It's interesting. I mean, if Gurdjieff's working with the mystery schools, can he actually say the real name? So Sarmoon is the name that he gave us, though. So that's about as far as anyone actually knows about the school because they are so secret. One of the things that's interesting is he said they were located in the heart of Central Asia. But he learned about them, in his travels all the way from Armenia to Egypt. And then, so it's literally Afghanistan where the main mystery school was that he was calling Sarmoon, but they had come originally from Egypt. So when we think about the troubles we've had in relation to Afghanistan and the bunker busters, what are they really blowing up down there? We have to kind of look at this thing in a different way. How many kind of activities against the positive mystery schools have we seen in the guise of these wars? Because those groups are fighting, and it's, we see it more and more out in the open. But one of the things I'd like to bring forward is that the mystery schools are deeply, deeply involved in our regular geopolitical life and our day-to-day lives. They play a much bigger role because usually the figures that are involved and the forces behind them are aligned with one group or another. And when they're aligned with those secret societies on the left-hand path, we get into all kinds of trouble because that's a very anti-human vision. And that's where the whole Ahrimanic force comes through.
Would you say the real benefit, I'm sitting here thinking, you can do a lot of work spiritually without being a member of a mystery school, but would it be specifically the practices and including the sort of body, mind, spirit practices that would be the greatest asset to being a member of a mystery school? That those practices that you would do and in groups and creating a coherence within the group that would help raise the frequency of the group, the consciousness together?
Yeah, think about it. I mean, what's the point of all this stuff? It's to make a better person. So you're there trying to be, if you make a better politician, a better statesman, a better journalist, a better librarian, a better web guy, whatever it happens to be, you become better. And the upshot of all of this knowledge and information is just to get you to a place where you become a better human being. So much of the other style of secret society that uses the same information, remember, and they have the same kind of long history, and we've had problems with them for centuries. They're not trying to build a better person. It's a more of a selfish cause. And so you're already going off the track, as it were. But you'll find that the secret societies are very orderly on the negative side as well. It's quite fascinating. They have their own rules of engagement as well. And we hear this kind of, once in a while you hear things bastardized as just straight out, well, this is an Illuminati thing or whatever. But there's a lot in there, because the actual Illuminati thing and the fact that the founding fathers were afraid in America that this group was coming over, from Germany to invade America. I mean, so the subject matter goes deep. You may know the very groups I'm talking about under different names. And that becomes an interesting kind of wave on this too. Wow, great questions. We're going to get more as we go. Fritz Peters, I'll give you a quick history on him because it's so interesting. His mother was an actress, and his aunt was Margaret Anderson, who's a big author on Gurdjieff work. And she was with Gurdjieff in the 20s and 30s in the big Paris period. And what happens is the mother gets sick and decides to stay over in America. And so Fritz Peters growing up 11 to 15 years old, lives at the Priory, and Gurdjieff is kind of a father figure for him. And Gurdjieff has him do things like, mow the lawn and stuff like that. But he has a number of interesting anecdotes. What happens is later, he goes off and, the mother comes back and reclaims him and stuff. And he has to kind of say goodbye to Gurdjieff. And he learns that Gurdjieff is coming to America, and he still has this kind of hero worship for him. And so what happens is Gurdjieff, he has a very interesting time with Gurdjieff when Gurdjieff comes over. And what happens is Gurdjieff needs to shake off the hero worship thing so this guy can kind of go live his life, basically. So this is a little interesting anecdote. And then there's another one that's a little bit more dramatic. But it must have taken us, Gurdjieff, conductor, the porter, and myself, at least 45 minutes to get to our assigned berths on the train. Gurdjieff's giving a speech in Chicago, and Fritz Peters, who's now an adult at 19, has met with him, and he's going to help him out on this trip. Our progress with all the luggage, as well as Gurdjieff's lamentations about the rude treatment he was receiving, were so noisy that we awakened almost everyone on the train. In every car, heads would appear through the curtains to hiss at us and curse us. I was furious with Gurdjieff, as well as exhausted, and greatly relieved when we found our berths. Then, to my horror, he decided he had to eat, drink, and smoke, and began unpacking his bag in search of food and liquor at that late hour. I was finally able to force him into the men's room. Once in there, he settled down to eat and drink and discourse in loud tones about the terrible service on American trains and the fact that he, a very important man, was treated in this shoddy fashion. When we were finally threatened in no uncertain terms by both the conductor and the porter, with expulsion from the train at the very next stop, I lost my temper completely and said to my teacher, Gurdjieff, that I would be glad to get off the train in order to get away from him. At this, he looked at me in wide-eyed innocence and wanted to know why I was angry with him. And if I was angry, why? I said I was furious and that he was making a spectacle of both of us. So he put his food and drink away sadly, and then lighting up another cigarette, mumbled to himself, I can't believe the terrible treatment I'm receiving. So Gurdjieff goes on this whole thing and embarrasses him and basically, plays this whole thing so that this kid, Fritz Peters, is going to lose all of the hero worship that he had all these years for Gurdjieff. And it's a way of kind of setting him free. But there's a series of very interesting anecdotes like that. What happens is he starts to Gurdjieff tells Peters what he sees about America and how the mystery schools are going to come to America and what they're looking for. This is pretty interesting. So he says, now, when I am, I tell many times that if we wish to observe ourselves, this is Gurdjieff talking to Fritz Peters, I need to start from outside by observing movements of our body. Only much later can we learn how to observe emotional and mental centers. Young people do not have very much inside, so much to observe yet. And this is also a good thing. One of the reasons I come to America is this is why I have many American students. Europeans are already blasé and know everything. They think they know about philosophy, religion, and other things. This is not true. They only have already formed inner self that makes them rotten inside because they're formed with unconsciousness. Americans are more receptive because they're not closed up inside yet. They're naive, yes. Stupid, perhaps, but still, they're real. Americans particularly have more chances to grow properly as men because you have not yet become, like you say, phony men. Now, this is very interesting, and I'm sure there's enough in there to offend everybody. But what's funny to me is that Gurdjieff is revealing an essential trait, which is, one, the pretension, and that we can't take ourselves too seriously because it blocks out avenues of knowing. So he's saying they're real, particularly they have a chance to grow properly as men because they've not yet become, as you say, phony men and women. For yourself, I can tell always, remember to look for reasons that the eye cannot see. You'll already notice the difference between Americans and the Europeans in terms of morality. And when you make judgments, you must observe it even deeper if you wish to understand. So he shares these kind of pieces with Peters over the years. and I find their interaction very interesting. So Peters kind of loses track of Gurdjieff, and he ends up in a kind of a journalistic thing covering the war. And he goes through very traumatic experiences, including being blown up. And then what happens is he comes back to visit Gurdjieff years later, and it's something like 8 years later, but he's been heavily traumatized. And Gurdjieff at first doesn't even recognize him. And it's funny because when we look at what Gurdjieff is trying to give him, it's this kind of balance at this late period in time. And he sees him and he realizes, oh my God, he's suffering from PTSD. So he says, come in, you can kind of sleep here and you can recover yourself and tell me what happened. And, basically Fritz Peters is coming back off almost like a nervous breakdown from his war experiences. And Gurdjieff is so, after having known him as a child and all this stuff and given him all these tools, he's looking at him and just very freaked out. So he says, I must go, but lie down. He said there was something very urgent in his voice, and I leaped to my feet to help him, but he waved me away and limped slowly out of the room. Gurdjieff's getting pretty old at this point. He's been through a lot himself. He was gone for perhaps 15 minutes while I watched the food, feeling blank and amazed because I'd never felt any better in my life. I was convinced then, as I am now, that he knew how to transmit energy from himself to others. I was also convinced that it could only be done at a great cost to himself. It also became obvious within the next few minutes that he knew how to renew his own energy quickly. And what happens, he describes this whole kind of unusual set of circumstance where Gurdjieff looks at him and a beam of blue light comes out of him and comes directly into his body, and he starts to feel an exhilaration. And suddenly it's almost like he's healing him from the PTSD. He feels great. He's fine. But Gurdjieff himself, his own appearance is deteriorating, and he's becoming even older and looking kind of, sad and ready for embalming. And what happens then at the end of that, he's transmitted this energy into him. And what Fritz Peters says, it also became obvious within the next few minutes that he knew how to renew his own energy quickly. For I was equally amazed when he returned to the kitchen to see the change in him. He looked like a young man again, alert, smiling, sly, and full of good spirits. He said that this was a very fortunate meeting, and that while I had forced him to make an almost impossible effort, a super effort, it had been, as I had witnessed, a very good thing for both of us. He then announced that we would have lunch together, and things go better for Fritz Peters after this meeting. Now, there's an interesting story about Gurdjieff at the end of his life also in relation to Bennett being there and the doctor coming in. And so they both look at him and it looks like Gurdjieff is about to die. This is in 1949, a few years later. And then they leave the room and the doctor notices Gurdjieff coming out of the room, and he's fully dressed and he looks about 20 years younger. And he walks up to the doctor and he thanks him for helping him, and says, "You've done a great job with me," and everything else. And he's absolutely shocked. And Bennett goes back to the doctor and says, "Where's Gurdjieff?" He said, "He left. He's completely rejuvenated. I don't know what's going on here." And then the next day, Gurdjieff is back and he will die within 3 days. But there's something very strange about this ability. It stays with him till the very end to completely transform his appearance, his body, and rejuvenate himself. There's a very telling anecdote that Ouspensky mentions that Gurdjieff had the ability to morph his actual appearance in public at any different occasion. And he recalls a particular occasion where they're seeing him off on a plane. And as he goes to turn, he looks at him and sort of smiles, and this little sly smile, and his whole appearance changes. So there's something in the mystery school record that it's something that Ouspensky calls plastics. But I would say that this is something which is a great skill that is acquired when you're an initiate in those schools. And I think the Peter stuff gives us something kind of hardcore on that. A little more about Peters, so we get an idea of just what rough shape he was in. I laid down on the bed. This is before he gets healed. I laid down on the bed and he left the room but did not close the door. I felt such enormous relief and such excitement at seeing him that I began to cry uncontrollably, and then my heart and my head began to pound. I could not rest and got up and walked to the kitchen, where I found him sitting at the table. He looked alarmed when he saw me and asked me what was wrong. I said I needed some aspirin or something for my headache, but he shook his head, stood up, and pointed to the other chair by the kitchen table. No medicine, he said firmly. I'll give you coffee. Drink it as hot as you can. I sat at the table while he heated the coffee and then served it to me. He then walked across the small room to stand in front of the refrigerator to watch me. I could not take my eyes off him and realized that he looked incredibly weary. I've never seen anything or anyone look so tired. I remember being slumped over the table, sipping at my coffee, when I began to feel a strange uprising of energy within myself. I stared at him. Strange uprising of energy, and I automatically straightened up, and it was as if a violent electric blue light emanated from him and entered into me. As this happened, I could feel the tiredness drain out of me, but at the same moment, his body slumped and his face turned gray as if it were being drained of life. I looked at him amazed. When he saw me sitting erect, smiling and full of energy, he said quickly, "You're all right now." So Gurdjieff had the ability as an initiate then to extend this kind of healing. So it's not only the plastics and changing the form, he can actually revive someone. Now, this is interesting. It's also another kind of American commentary by Gurdjieff. In speaking of contemporary America, Gurdjieff sometimes made reference to the new American gods, the scientists, more particularly the personal gods, doctors and psychiatrists. He seemed to feel that doctors were a dangerous breed, for even though they were often motivated by high-sounding principles, such as the dedication to saving the lives of people, they knew very, very little about humanity, and almost nothing about the interrelation of the mind, the emotions, and the body, and what their aim was not generally to aid or save people, but simply to eradicate disease. He said that man was not only the chief, but perhaps the only organism that interfered and interfaced constantly and radically under the balance of nature, a very dangerous activity under any circumstances, and particularly dangerous when men did not know what they were doing and did not even take nature into consideration. He said that nature was infinitely patient, consistently adapting herself to the strains imposed on her by these machinations of mankind, especially scientists, but he warned that nature would, in the long run, be forced to get even, as it were, and impose a proper balance and harmony on humanity. He's so on the bullseye with this, and just think of what we just went through with the COVID op and all the questions about it. He's seeing what's going to become America in just a little while. And so we're getting this kind of deep impression of his realization of the superficiality of the culture and some of his own deep abilities. And these are leading him in the fourth way through his main pupil, Ouspensky, to create in America this line of fourth way mystery schools. And the fourth way schools are designed to be a balance against this. And they are designed to be small numbers of people working together to be self-sufficient, but also to explore their own possible evolution, humanity's evolution. So when we're looking at that and we see the kind of inroads that they made, and we're looking at the kind of unfinished work in relation to this, you say to yourself, why isn't right now, say, the fourth way far more known than it is? Just like the Rudolf Steiner schools or theosophy. Well, they're certainly known in certain circles, and we certainly talk about them on this program. But in the wider culture, it's pretty interesting. Well, we've pointed out where they've made dramatic inroads of moving that culture forward in a very quiet fashion, Waldorf schools and things of this nature. But it is quite fascinating. Could it be that the fourth way schools were meant to completely enlighten the culture, and that they were, in fact, derailed from doing that? I'm going to get into that as the next part of this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, deep tonight. on the mystery schools. Gurdjieff, The Fourth Way, Ouspensky, Bennett, Fritz Peters, the whole gang is there. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly, and it's great to have so many of you with us. Miss Olivia, before I go any further.
Jordan Banner wanted to know, is this ability to morph accessing other lifetime appearances? Would that be one explanation?
I think when you lift up to a certain level of, awareness, and you've practiced and studied on an initiatory level, that things like morphing your appearance, shapeshifting, literally become second nature, something that you can do. It's interesting what you're talking about, though, about past lives, because I remember that when Edgar Cayce was talking about being able to see the incredible color patterns and auras around people, and he could always see this color meant that they had this kind of health, or this meant that they were angry, or this meant that they were reading, they would emanate different colors. What Cayce would do when he was talking to people, when they would be talking about certain things, he would see their past lives in that aura, playing like a movie. So there is something there about seeing the previous life. Yeah, what do you got?
The other thing, Mason Strunk wanted you to know, there's a book called The Shamanic Way of the Bee, which is a modern man's account of being inducted into a mystery school whose basis is beekeeping and psychedelic honey.
Well, look, if you get me near psychedelic honey, it's all over.
Sounds great.
But that is very interesting. I'll look for it. I'm always reading on that side. So let's see. So we'll take your questions here in about 15 minutes. What can I add? I'm going to add a little more on Bennett and how he viewed what was going on in relation to Gurdjieff in the future. So there's a book called Gurdjieff Making a New World, which is what I think Gurdjieff was after with the group. Let's see how well they can do. So he's talking about the Masters of Wisdom, and this gets into Shambhala and all of these different kind of legends that exist about this group that are out there guiding humanity. And so he says, surprisingly enough, the tradition of the Masters is almost unknown in India. When Helena Blavatsky published her books, The Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled, one of her chief claims was to have encountered in person some of the masters in or beyond Tibet. The belief in masters then becomes an integral part of the Theosophical doctrine, but it acquired an occult character that weakened its credibility. Much of the mystery of the Theosophical masters derived from their supposed location in Tibet, though Blavatsky herself asserted that their headquarters was beyond the mountains in the legendary Shambhala. I'm going to open that up a little bit more too. Now, here's the funny twist for Bennett. Ready? It never occurred to me that this place was more than a pure invention until quite recently Idries Shah suggested to me that its name could have been derived from Shami Bak, the Bactrian Sun Temple, the ruins of which can still be seen in Bak near the northern frontier of Afghanistan. Rudolf Steiner associated Bak with the center of Mithraic sun worship. There's a lot in that. There's a lot of openings that Bennett is giving us there. One is he's saying, he's going in kind of cynical about the masters in relation to Blavatsky. And then he's like, oh, wait a minute. This place could be directly related. And then we have the crossover of Steiner talking about Mithraic religion having its center in the Bactrians, which is very unusual piece in Afghanistan. And where does the Gurdjieff work take us in terms of the mystery schools? Well, the brotherhood that he studies with is right there in Afghanistan. So we're looking at a lot of crisscrossing of information, but here's something to consider. If you were going to really have the mystery schools survive through time and even survive industrialization, where would you put them? I mean, you might put them in Antarctica, but that would be hard for them to get by, maybe. Well, Afghanistan is really hard. It's hard terrain to get around. Central Asia is pretty hard in general. And it seems very appropriate, doesn't it, that this was the kind of prime location for them. Interestingly enough, when Ouspensky goes on his In Search of the Miraculous tour, which is before he met Gurdjieff, even though he'll eventually call his Gurdjieff book In Search of the Miraculous, the original name of that book was Fragments of an Unknown Teaching, which I find very telling whenever we get around that book. The book is incredible and just transformative, just reading that book, and contains information that you could study for decades. But one of the things that I think is interesting in relation to this is that he goes around to India and he can't find anything resembling the mystery school. So he's completely shut out. It's not until he comes back and hears about Gurdjieff that he has some kind of entree into this other world of mystery knowledge. That's pretty compelling. So the mystery schools, it's a mystery for a reason. They're very, very underground. Yes. You got anything else?
That's it for now.
Okay, good. I'm going to move into a little bit of Ouspensky, actually. I've got this. I've got two sections here. I have one mind blower section with Akhenaten relating to the Gurdjieff work, and then I have another mind blower, which is Frank Lloyd Wright. I'm going to do the Frank Lloyd Wright part really quickly. So let's get a couple of oriented pieces around Frank Lloyd Wright. There he is now. That is Frank Lloyd Wright putting together Talcyon, but it's the Talcyon version that's in Scottsdale, Arizona, which is the one he would spend the most time at. That is J.G. Bennett there. And that's Gurdjieff's top pupil, as we mentioned. We have Frank Lloyd Wright working closely with the Gurdjieff group, and he creates his own group, Talcyon, basically around the same exact principles. As I said, his wife was involved in it. Some of the festivals of Talcyon, when you look at it, I mean, it looks pretty interesting. Miss Olivia, that's got to be right up your alley. Look at that.
Oh, love it.
This is...
what year is that?
It's probably the 50s, the 40s or 50s, and they have a great sense of bringing in this celebratory idea, but they are involved with bringing forward the creativity in individuals, and in his case, architecture, but all sorts of different arts. And when we have that connection with Wright, we have to understand there's a big impact with that, because Wright is an entree to all these other figures. And that's why this is the Scottsdale, actually, Talcyon that Wright put together and spent most of his time at. The original Talcyon, actually, there's a lot of tragedies associated with it, interestingly enough. One of them is, his mistress was killed, and the servant from Barbados burned the original Talcyon down. And again, when he puts it all back together and goes through the whole scandal of the thing and everything else, and he builds it again, it also gets burned down a second time. So there's some interference around Frank Lloyd Wright that I find kind of fascinating. If any of you have watched my Female Targets videos about George Hodel, in fact, Hodel would buy the kind of Mayan complex that Frank Lloyd Wright Jr. puts together. And so I think that there is direct interference with this line coming forward in the public. And Olgivanna, it becomes his second wife, and she is the one who is in the priory with Gurdjieff and becomes one of his main teachers. She's particularly obsessed with the Gurdjieff movements, and between the two of them, they make quite a pair.
One thing, Catherine Harris says that he probably built on top of native graves.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, the first Talcyon, I guess, is Wisconsin. And the second one in Scottsdale is no problem at all. And he lived most of the time there. But that first one, forget it. It's just over and over again he encounters this problem. So let's see if I can bring this all around. I do think that Frank Lloyd Wright and the intentional community around him, again, he's in America. Gurdjieff wants to build the priory originally in the Southwest, and he gets the funding, he gets everything, and it's going to be located in Taos, New Mexico. And what happens is the senator who's helping him arrange for the whole thing blows up in a plane crash, in one of the biggest airplane crashes of that period. It's the late 20s. And that's the end of the whole operation. So Gurdjieff, once again, has to go back to France. There's a block against establishing the fourth way work in America. And eventually they will. But again, they have to use avenues and different methods in order to achieve that. Let's see what we can do here. An interesting kind of sideshow in all this is this Orage, Mary Poppins piece. And then I'm also going to read something from Henry Olcott, which brings this around, about resistance going on from other secret societies, from this better line of esoteric information being given an entree into the United States. Not only will that affect the kind of, mystical lines that are happening in the different schools that study these things, but also the political process is going to be right in the crossfire of all that. This individual is A.R. Orage. Orage coined this whole New Age term. He created a magazine called The New Age in 1912, and he covered all these people: Gurdjieff, Ouspensky, Steiner, the whole thing. And what was the Autobiography of a Yogi again?
Who wrote it?
Yes.
Oh
our friend.
Yogananda.
No, yes, Yogananda. He references Orage, and Orage is really a major influence. He's not talked about very much, but he was a major student, and he became, after Ouspensky, basically came to a point with Gurdjieff where he could not work with him anymore, that he basically became the new Ouspensky, and he had the connections. He had a great deal of connections there in that New York world. He was from London, but he went over to America and made a great splash for Gurdjieff there. And what had happened was they had decided that in 1924, Gurdjieff was going to come over to Boston and New York, and he was going to give the display of his groups, the dancing groups, who were doing temple dances. And these were associated with the Enneagram. And this whole thing about the stop exercise, which had never been done before in the West. So he was going to give them this very kind of esoteric piece. And then he made a pronouncement to these Harvard professors that if they attended and gave him a certain type of material, they would see types of phenomena that had never been seen in the West, period. Harvard became very anti-Gurdjieff. They didn't want anything to do with it. But New York was more open. And so the stop exercises and the dance and everything else that was set up by Orage actually came to pass. And there's very unusual stories about it. But the original performance that took place on those New York stages of the Gurdjieff movements were seen and are recorded in like New York Times critics' histories and things. And interestingly enough, in performing this exercise at the end of the show, the dancers leap off the stage and land on the audience. But instead of feeling like bodies falling on bodies, it's like pillows hitting them. And it has something to do with Gurdjieff teaching the dancers how to manipulate their muscles in a certain fashion. So this is kind of like early stage diving going on here. Very punk rock, I guess you could say. So, but it is fascinating because when you look at that, they're like, oh, and then at the end of the performance, the dancers leaped off into the audience, but it didn't hurt anybody. So the stop exercise itself becomes a very unusual piece in all this. Gurdjieff talks about it as a major component taught in the mystery schools, and Ouspensky does a really good exposition in Search of the Miraculous. What takes place is you're doing your kind of regular routine, and then your mystery school teacher says, stop. So whatever you do, you are stopping it right when they yell stop. And then your whole body has to take on a certain pose in order to be able to do this. The idea is that we have a series of poses in day-to-day life that we take on. And if we interrupt that pattern, we'll get to see things in a new way. So, and there's all sorts of interesting pieces in relation to this. But the dancing and the type of dancing that Gurdjieff brought over, again, he'd got directly out of these monasteries associated with the mystery schools. So he had that advanced piece. If you look, you'll find all of this music associated with the Gurdjieff work with Thomas de Hartmann, who was a major, he's kind of like the John Williams of his day. And Gurdjieff, he was a major student of Gurdjieff for years. And they put together this incredible body of music. At the very end of his life, Gurdjieff's recording himself on the harmonium. And if you listen to those recordings, they are very unusual because they're going to this advanced emotional center place. Highly recommended indeed. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, deep here tonight on Gurdjieff and the Fourth Way. I'm going to see how much of the rest of this I can get in. A little more on A.R. Orage, because there's this interesting link on the Mary Poppins thing. And I mentioned this to Olivia earlier, which is, as soon as I started to open this up, all this weird Mary Poppins stuff came up completely out of the blue. So the X series works like that. You're on the right track. Okay. So here's a review of Orage's book that I think has a couple of very kind of interesting pieces. One, in addition to meticulously reconstructing the account of Orage and his wife and their relationship to Gurdjieff, he's included vital extracts from published and unpublished material relating to Gurdjieff and Orage during the period and set in the background of current events. He carefully notes and discusses where Orage's record differs from prevalent opinion. To all this, Taylor has added an original examination of the varied career that prepared Orage for his meeting with Gurdjieff, an account of the final years of his life. This is an interesting thing. Orage now is the entree that Gurdjieff needs in America. So we've seen that the senator who was helping Gurdjieff, his plane goes down. Frank Lloyd Wright has a number of his own problems. So there's problems with Gurdjieff getting through in America and those connections sticking. So then Orage is helping Gurdjieff and he's bringing things through, and Gurdjieff gives him a really hard time as well. There's a lot of that posturing and, the same stuff that he does with Ouspensky, that Ouspensky eventually is like, I'm out of here. And what happens with Orage is he has a heart attack in the middle of all this. So then again, we have somebody else who's poised and who was working with Gurdjieff on Beelzebub's Tales, the book, and he was putting these performances together, and boom, he goes down with a heart attack. What do you got?
I'm sorry. Kate Schneider says Mary Poppins used as backdrop for COVID predictive programming of 2012 Olympics.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's fascinating. The 2012 Olympic space. Whoa, indeed. Great point. Well, we found out some very interesting things. P.L. Travers, this is her book. Remember, she wrote Mary Poppins. Here it is. Her book, Gurdjieff, by P.L. Travers. It's a little book, but she spent decades under his wing. And she says, black magic, according to Gurdjieff, has always one definite characteristic. It is the tendency to use people for some, even the best of aims, without their knowledge and understanding, either by producing in them faith and infatuation or by acting upon them through fear. There is, in fact, neither red, green, nor yellow magic. There is doing. Only doing is magic. Properly to realize the scale of what Gurdjieff meant by magic, one has to remember he continually repeated the aphorism, only he who can be can do. And its corollary that lacking this fundamental verb, nothing is done, but simply happens. Very interesting. There's a lot of that, and you can see that deep respect that she has for him in here. It's a little booklet. George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, P.L. Travers wrote Mary Poppins. And her background is also very interesting, I think, from Australia and with that deep Shakespeare background and just the incredible things of Walt Disney trying to get his hands on Mary Poppins for years, and then her being very, very unhappy with the end product, oddly enough. So we have something else there that I think is interesting, which is Tom Hanks plays Walt Disney in the movie of her life, selling that, which try that one on. That kind of jives, doesn't it? One of the things that Araj helps Gurdjieff with is Beelzebub's tales to his grandson. Now, in Beelzebub's tales, as I mentioned, Beelzebub is flying around in a spaceship. The name of the spaceship is Karnak, as in Karnak, Egypt. Well, who's over in Karnak, Egypt? There's all kinds of interesting things there, of course. There have been great researchers who've gone into the real depth. John Anthony West, Carmen Bolter, they've both left us, but their incredible work is behind. Well, there was a temple of Akhenaten in Karnak, Egypt. And we know Akhenaten had really his own mystery schools going on, the mystery schools in Egypt. And he's battling against the Amun Brotherhood, who is handling all of the religious traditions and basically selling people the idea that, you know, selling ascension, basically. The Akhenaten Nefertiti story, very deep, pictured very unusually, as I said, with the long, elongated heads. Who were they really? And were they a different type of being trying to help humanity manifest in a better fashion? There's something very interesting and compelling about Akhenaten and Nefertiti and their son, Tutankhamun, and the fact that he's trying to bring about a one God religion and get rid of this pantheon of Egyptian gods and the whole kind of rigmarole that the Amun priesthood has put together. So he gets targeted. He moves the center of Egypt. And so he creates all sorts of problems for him. Eventually, they just get rid of him, and then they wipe off his name on as many monuments as they can. However, he created Karnak. And some of those temples, even though they were destroyed, there's evidence there of Akhenaten still. It also contains Hatshepsut's very, very interesting construction. So here we have something very much like Cleopatra's Needle. And when you see these throughout Washington, D.C., and you see that correlation with Egypt, in fact, that they shipped over many of these, you know that continuity of the mystery school activity directly from Egypt to Washington, D.C. is something that involves the early foundation of America and America as New Atlantis. So here we are in the middle of all that mystical pieces. We know if you look at America and you look at the early founding of it, you're going to find Masonic rites, you're going to find Templar activity. You're going to be looking at an entirely mystical setup for the entire continent. In fact, the word America is a Templar term. I always love that story about Amerigo Vespucci, and how we were all taught, hey, it was Amerigo Vespucci. And if you go in now to the history, he was one of the first guys who had a printing press. And he's writing his own stuff, and they're asking him, hey, is America named after you? You know, this is like 1814 or whatever. He writes, no, like, you know, the name was already there. I had nothing to do with it. They didn't name it after me. What is this nonsense, you know? So he's on record saying that Amerigo has nothing to do. So America, they just, for some reason, they don't want to tie it directly to this Templar tradition, but that's a Templar term. So we have a lot of good people out there doing kind of the esoteric America, the symbolism, if you go through DC and all the rest of it. So that plays in here. The piece of it I want to kind of tune in on is the Karnak piece. And then I've been doing my best with Beelzebub to extract some of the Atlantis information out of it. There's a book that's just come out. By the way, that's another picture of the original Talcyon before it got burned down. Very interesting. Of course, Frank Lloyd Wright and his designs off the charts. So this is fascinating. One of the interesting people doing work around Atlantis out of the UK is Jocelyn Godwin. And he's been on this track of Atlantis for a while, but he also does some other mystical things. I always enjoy his books. One of the things that he was talking about in relation to Gurdjieff's version of the Atlantis piece, I found interesting. And just before it, there's a piece about Mount Shasta in there. Let's see if I can squeeze this in. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show, going deep here tonight on Gurdjieff the Fourth Way and Mystery School America, P.D. Ouspensky and Bennett and the whole crew. Okay, the coasts of California, Oregon, and Washington are the only remnant of the Lemurian continent and the oldest inhabited, cultivated, civilized land on the face of the earth, which is still practically the same in physical form and in the same environment as when God first created it. Not only have the Lemurians left their writing on the rocks, they are hiding out there, and this accounts for the innumerable reports of mysterious lights seen in the region. Now, he is drawing on George Hunt Williamson and all these other people for this isn't his thinking. He's actually kind of summarizing their opinion of and the Shasta mysticism. So, and the idea basically that Mount Shasta houses the Lemurians, who were this advanced race that were in the Pacific, and then, when the continent went down, came to Mount Shasta and reside in the mountain. Okay. And there's a lot of very interesting stories in relation to that, of course. So nowhere is this more certain than around Mount Shasta, where the astronomer Edgar Lucian Larkin saw through his telescope 3 golden domes among the trees of the mountains. Then there are the odd-looking persons who still come into the lowlands to make purchases, always paying in gold dust or nuggets and never accepting change. Their foreheads down to the nose is always covered with a special decoration, obviously to hide some kind of psychic feature. Other denizens are sometimes spotted on the highway, garbed in pure white and in sandals, long curly hair, tall and majestic in appearance, but impossible to photograph or talk to because they just vanish. More suspicions yet is the tendency of automobiles, when brought too close to the haunted mountain, to suffer seizure of their electrical systems, loss of power. Hundreds of people have been seen oddly shaped boats fly high in the air over the ocean and then continue on in the sea. Only recently, a group of persons playing golf saw a peculiar silver-like vessel rise in the air and float over the mountaintops and disappear. It is unlike any airship that has ever been seen, and there was absolutely no noise emanating from it. That's a quote. The silent, boat-shaped silver objects resemble Scott Elliott, the Theosophist, Atlantean airships, which he wrote about in 1878. But before dismissing this as a fantasy, I would point out that the effects on automobiles anticipate by several decades a stock element of the UFO encounters. So a lot of these groups that come out as kind of Lemurian fellowships are from the 1920s and 1930s. And they are plugging in all this information that sounds eerily like UFO abductions, and the same types of things. They're looking at airships. Their cars won't work, this whole thing, the whole apotheum effect. Okay. And AMORC was a Rosicrucian group that was promoting this as well, which was like a modern version, modern in the sense of 20th century. Okay. Couple of key points about Beelzebub's tale. Gurdjieff included quite an expansive Atlantis story in his book, All and Everything, also known as Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. There's a weird thing going on here about titles. Everything that Gurdjieff does has about 3 different titles, and his birth date changes from 1866, 1872 to 1877. And the P.L. Travers, the Mary Poppins author, also told everyone that she was born in 1906, but she was actually born in 1899. So this happened with Jean Dixon as well. There's an interesting piece with this, and I've pointed it out before, and it doesn't have anything to do with, ageist elitism or anything like that. They're not doing it for age purposes. They're changing the dates around their birth date when they're involved with mystical work because they know that other groups can deduce so much about them by their actual birth date. Now, this is an interesting point, which is in his book, Steiner talking about Blavatsky and about the whole theosophical influence, he has a very interesting response where he says, actually, those groups were very aware of her coming in. So they knew astrologically that somebody of this stature was coming in. So that's the level of detail. So whenever I see that, I think to myself, somebody's using the dating changes for a very, very specific purpose. So we should keep that in mind when we say it. Okay. All and Everything is notoriously unreadable work, as I said. I've read it, and I've read it for years, and it's still very hard to go down. It's like Ulysses, probably even more dense. I'm trying to think of a really good example of what it's like, but it's sort of like the Book of the Dead in a way. There's a lot of symbolism in there. Only someone already captivated by Gurdjieff's teaching would read it through once, let alone 3 times. A.R. Orage, who was like one of the top literary people in England, who helped Gurdjieff with this, said it was one of the most difficult things that he ever had to do, editing this book. And then his version, he dies in the mid-30s. The book doesn't actually come out till 1950, a year after Gurdjieff's death. Think about that. Here's another thing, is this may be a mystery school signature. Ouspensky dies, and his book In Search of the Miraculous about Gurdjieff comes out in 1947. Gurdjieff dies in 1949, and then in 1950, Beelzebub's Tales can actually come out. This may be part of it, which is while you're alive, that book may not be able to be published on that level. Certainly Gurdjieff and Ouspensky had both published other books, but I found that pretty interesting. So in talking about Beelzebub now, here is Jocelyn Goodwin trying to interpret a little bit for us based on the text. We begin with the origin of the moon. Long ago, owing to a miscalculation by the individual responsible, a comet collided with the Earth and struck off 2 fragments. This is from Gurdjieff's Beelzebub. One of them was the moon, and the other was known to the Atlanteans, but it was so small and remote that it's now forgotten. After a while, the 2 fragments settled down in orbit around the Earth, and they became unstable. To avoid future trouble, the commission that takes care of such things arranged that the Earth should constantly send to the moon a certain type of vibration generated when beings die. As the human race evolved in intelligence, the commission worried lest it should discover the arrangements. If humans realized the purpose of their existence was merely to feed the moon, they might rebel and destroy themselves out of spite. The commission, therefore, caused a special organ to grow at the base of the human spine that prevented this. The organ is called the Kunda buffer. This is an interesting thing that Gurdjieff inserts here, because Kundalini is what is traditionally understood as the base of the spine that rides up to the third eye, and we become enlightened and become yogis and everything else. Well, here he is using it in a slightly different way and saying this Kunda buffer actually prevents humanity from seeing things as they actually are.
I actually think I want to just make a point here. The Kunda buffer is so interesting and so important. So everybody pay attention, because you're not going to hear this anywhere else.
It is quite unusual. Although this organ was afterward withdrawn, its effects remained. Try that one out. Including the tendency of humans to kill one another. No other planet's intelligent beings behave like this. So much for the UFO threat, right? Beelzebub made 6 descents from Mars to Earth. The first time he was deposited by a spaceship on the shores of Atlantis, where a young member of his species had meddled in the government there and caused a constitutional crisis. So there's all these flavors, and it goes on. And my summary on it would be that what's going on is that Gurdjieff's giving us an incredibly modern take. And Godwin, when he's looking at the Gurdjieff text, says most of Beelzebub is actually written in the 20s. Where is he getting the spaceship piece and this whole kind of sci-fi UFO approach, which is really kind of perfect for when it comes out in 1950. So Gurdjieff, again, is looking ahead, and he's laying out all kinds of things about the origins of humanity and how, the group from Mars, who are under the heading of Beelzebub, are coming down and interfering with Earth's evolutionary patterns. And he talks about a second sideline group that's evolving right beside humanity that sounds just like the Atlantean automatons that we've gone into so deeply on this program. So we're looking now at a really kind of fascinating piece with Gurdjieff going deep on Atlantis and tying it into a visitor species, an interdimensional or intergalactic group that's visiting here and trying to fix things. And some of them go down there and kind of mess around, and we get very strange results. I'm going to go deeper. I'll pick up on these pieces as we go, but it's just about time to turn it over to you, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so I guess Kate Garcia says Glenn Beck referred to the USA as the new Atlantis on his show last night.
Wow.
And John Howard says, this is the same battle now as in Atlantis. The Sons of Belial destroyed it. The cast of characters is presently incarnated, lots of black magicians, and with electronic/EMF support.
Well, what happens when we become aware of that kind of black magic activity? And can buffer against it, then the political situation becomes very different. And it's funny because that piece about New Atlantis and Francis Bacon and all the rest, and how, we were developed here, and our revolution happens on July 4th, and the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, this whole piece is related directly to Francis Bacon saying, hey, July 4th is when I'm going to put out this New Atlantis thing. Well, that happens in the 16th century. So the founding fathers on purpose delay the actual Declaration of Independence to line up perfectly with the same exact date. So they're interpreting what we're doing here as the reenactment of Atlantis, but a new version, a more enlightened version that won't destroy itself. And there's a Hermetic tradition tied to this, the mystery school tradition, carrying on from the destruction of Atlantis through the Egyptian mystery schools, Pythagoras, going through this whole thing and carrying on the steganography of that whole development. This is where we start to understand the history of it. And those groups kind of come out of the shadows for us. We can see them for who they are. But there's definitely a group inside the mystery schools that's dedicated to moving humanity forward. And that's the piece I think that we're looking for. But there's no question that the secret society, left-hand path schools are deeply, deeply involved in our government. And now I think it's more obvious than ever. Yes.
Robert Scott, why did G focus on Beelzebub? I can't see that being a good thing. Was it an ironic device?
Well, look, Gurdjieff wrote Meetings with Remarkable Men. It was easy to read. They made a movie out of it, and it was supposedly his autobiography. And it's remarkable what a great, just fantastic read that is. Beelzebub, the minute you get into it, it has all sorts of strange words on purpose. And he says like, oh, the effect of that energy is noodle voodoo. And, he does all kinds of this stuff. And so there is almost an irony with it where, he's looking at other mystery traditions coming out and like what Theosophy did. And all these people are trying to figure out, well, the chakra systems and all this other stuff, but they're not getting the essentials right out the gate. They're not understanding their own personal, abilities and shortfalls. And so they, it's becoming kind of a fantasy field. And I think that what he's doing is he's threading in the real story of the Atlantean piece, of the visitor piece, of the esoteric mystery school piece, but it's so threaded, so heavily densified that Ouspensky, when he goes to read it, and he's been out of contact with Gurdjieff for years, that he says, I can't read it. So Ouspensky couldn't read it. And he said, oh, it's the result of a warped mind. And Gurdjieff had been, he came out of these mystery schools, but he'd been disconnected from that whole thing for how long? For decades. So, to me, it feels like this was his grand opus. And it took 20 years to get that thing published. I do think that there's something powerful in it, and whenever I read it, I feel like it's coded through and through. But it's not a kind of malevolent coding. It's something that if you spend the time with it, it's very much like a puzzle. And so I don't know if I can recommend Beelzebub, but if you've been reading it as long as I have, you can pull things out of it that maybe will open the reader up. He recommends reading it 3 different ways. Read it the first time as if you'd read anything. Read it the second time, really trying to understand every little piece of it, and read it the third time out loud. And let me tell you, reading it out loud is a weird experience. Yes.
I wanted to make sure I read this question or comment. Robert Scott again. I'm in Seattle all next week for business. Going to have to convince my boss to go look for Lemurians. And it made me think of Timothy Good and that story that he relayed when you interviewed him about, didn't he intend to go meet an alien? And there was one that somebody came and sat next to him on a bench, and he sort of psychically or telepathically communicated with him, if you are what I think you are, do X, whatever it was. And I'm just saying that there is something to intention.
Yes.
Yeah. You want to follow that up a little?
That's a really good point. No, I think you've nailed it.
Okay.
Actually.
All right. You don't have to go looking for them. You can
you magnetize it too.
Go get a sandwich, sit on a bench and say, if any are around, I'm open. Like, come and see me.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Good was fascinating because he'd gone through, he did Above Top Secret. He'd gone through all of the traditional, like, I'm going to talk to the Pentagon about UFOs and get answers and stuff. But this guy was a real researcher out of the UK. And at a certain level, he was like, I've heard so much about these things that I'm going to try myself to contact them, go around like this whole government apparatus. And he felt that he had encountered beings from somewhere else here who were totally human looking. And, my interview is there with him. That's the last interview that he gave because he had health issues after that. And he doesn't work anymore. But I feel that he kind of has the right idea there, which is we have the ability to communicate on that level. Now, I do feel like Ingo Swann's things in relation to what he said about encountering beings that he thought weren't from here. He said the first thing that you notice about them is they're telepathic. Well, he had met them first when doing remote viewing. So when he encountered them in person somewhere by accident, he noticed, oh, here's the signature. They're telepathic. So for whatever that's worth, I thought that that's a pretty good telltale sign that that he was giving us there as a kind of a hint. And I always thought Swann's work, he worked for the government, he worked underground, he'd been taken and was working for God knows what groups, because at a certain point he didn't even realize, who the hell are these people? It's not Russell Targ anymore. Who are these guys? And he also said that, in his book about remote viewing the moon, he talks about how the group that wanted him to do that, the people who would pick him up were twins. Mm-hmm. And then later when he tried to track it back through the government, it didn't wash. And he said, well, they must have either not wanted it to be this way, or he's like, I'm getting a real impression that these were like hybrid beings, literally. So that's what Swann put on the record. And, who am I to disagree? Yes.
Okay, just getting back to the previous topic.
Yes.
Shamanist Anamkara wants to know, DJ, do you think reading the book the third time out loud is casting a spell?
I remember a very interesting thing about Gurdjieff saying that there were people who were not from the West, but were from the East, who still had the ability to absorb musical sounds in a different way than we would. And when that musical sounds would, those musical sounds would put them in almost like a somnambulist state where they could do kind of Casey trance reading type things. And Fritz Peters recounts one of these girls who comes to the priory with her parents, and she's one of these people who can absorb music in this way. And de Hartmann is playing this Gurdjieff music piece, and she goes into that trance. So I think that there's a sound vibrational aspect involved with mystery school teaching. That's where the whole Tibetan bells pieces are, to put you in a different frame of mind. You know, John Anthony West told me about the sound festivals that they did at the Great Pyramid. And I think that that's where that's going, that there's something in Beelzebub's tale when it's read aloud has that resonance. I don't know what section of the book, and it's a long book, let me tell you. But it is compelling, and it simultaneously reads like you're, you know, going through this interesting history, you know, this story that he's telling. And then he starts talking about very random things like, you know, can you believe the like terrible music that they're doing in these jukebox places? And he goes off on these tangents, and it's like, what is he trying to achieve here? He's trying to put you on different tracks as you go. So you're always off balance. You're not reading the book the way you would a normal story. It's all sort of chopped up, and it's like being in a blender when you read it. Yes. A mental
D.
blender.
Baker. What did the Nazis think of Gurdjieff?
Well, the Nazis occupied France when Gurdjieff was there, and he laid low. There's no indication that he had any involvement with them, except that he didn't cause any trouble for them. It is known that he did some spying for the Russians back during the Rasputin period. And later, when Ouspensky found this out, he was like, oh my God, a spiritual teacher who's a spy, you know, like, and he had almost a puritanical view of him. And Bennett was like, you know, Gurdjieff did a lot of different things in his life. And he didn't see that as a disqualifying aspect at all. He just saw that as a leg of Gurdjieff opening up his different options. And what's interesting too is that apparently there was a competition at one point for who was going to be working with the czars. Was it going to be Rasputin or Gurdjieff? And it ended up being Rasputin. The other weird thing about Gurdjieff is that he went to school with Joseph Stalin. So when you get around Gurdjieff, you're in the center of this swirl of political, spiritual, esoteric information. And then you go back and you say, huh, you know, his whole thing was Sarmoon Brotherhood, bringing the Enneagram over and trying to found the Fourth Way School in America, in New Mexico, in Arizona, and in New York. And then, you know, him getting kind of shunted off and moved aside really gives one pause as to what they wanted to stop for him in America, because he seems incredibly well politically connected, as well as these other things. I wanted to show the Enneagram and his description of it, and then we'll jump right back into your questions. How does that grab
Sounds
you?
good.
Okay. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here with X Series 139, going deep on the mystery schools and going deep on Gurdjieff in America. We're taking your questions now. We'll go for like another half hour or so. How does that grab you?
Sounds great.
Okay, good. So the Enneagram is a very important piece that Gurdjieff brings through. I want to make this really clear that the stuff that came up later about the Enneagram, about using it as a personality system, about Oscar Acaso and these other people saying, oh no, we're not using the Gurdjieff one. We just found this other one in South America. Hey, no, it doesn't happen. Gurdjieff brought this symbol over, and you can't find it anywhere except in deep, deep Christian mysticism from medieval periods. There's some indications of this. This is a 9-pointed star figure, which Gurdjieff described in detail in Search of the Miraculous, trying to get us kind of oriented around the idea of what it was And what he would say is that the mystery schools used it as a kind of way to measure people. And he also said that if you think of the Enneagram, you can't think of it the way that it's traditionally, presented as just a symbol. You have to think of it as moving. And so when they would do the temple dances and things of this nature, they would have people dancing those lines. They'd go within those lines while they were doing the whole thing. That, I think, tells us a great deal about what it is. And then later, it comes up as, it becomes so popular, actually, in the early 2000s as a personality testing thing based on these other groups. And the other groups didn't want to pay the Gurdjieff, archives for bringing the Enneagram forward. So they made up a story about finding it themselves, which it was already out there. Gurdjieff would put it out there. Let's just be real. So there's a little bit of, let's say, lack of sincerity on that one. So, but the Enneagram itself is a powerful symbol, and it's something coming through the Gurdjieff work that he's gifting us as a tool of study to kind of open up a whole mystery tradition through. And I think in the study of the Enneagram, we're looking at something which is completely from deep inside that mystery tradition that was let out. We talk so much about the mystery school wars that took place that Steiner talked about in the 19th century, saying that there was this battle between these schools about should we let the information out or not. The Enneagram is a piece of that. It comes out through Gurdjieff's work in about 1919. Yes.
Brandon Lashbrook. G wanted the wisdom of the East and energy of the West to harmonize to stop self-destruction, they say.
Yes.
Is that what his intention was?
Harmonizing, absolutely. And that's a big piece of what he was trying to do. Remember, it's harmonious development of humanity. So what he said was the modern structure and the industrial world had created an imbalance, and that the civilization that we had was heading towards a disaster because of the imbalance, and that you weren't developing humanity upon the lines of balance, spiritually, mentally, physically. The whole thing was going into over emphasis on scientific materialism. The exact same stream of thought comes out of the Steiner work, even though people wouldn't think of Steiner in relation to Gurdjieff's work at all, because, again, Steiner's working with the Akashic. He's working with a lot of different things. Excuse me. So that, I think, is very telling. But also, when we look at it, he's developing many sides at once. So you're doing an exercise where, you take a day and you observe yourself doing unnecessary talking. That's one exercise. You do another exercise.
Man, that is hard. I admit it. As a chick, that's hard.
You do another exercise the next day about unnecessary worrying. One of the first rules that they have
is worrying. Ever necessary? Worry is not.
No.
Problem solving is one thing. Worry seems like it's always unnecessary.
No, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I think it's a substitute for working on something.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting about worry, and there's a kind of artificial suppression in the Gurdjieff system of any negative thinking, because they talk about all these different centers that you have, and then they consider negative emotions as an unnecessary center. It's an artificial one that is just kind of glommed onto humanity. It's not natural. And he said, someone was asking him questions, and they were saying, well, I always have these, sense of dread and all this stuff, and I have all these negative fantasies. And Gurdjieff said, well, look, I can understand people having positive fantasies. Like, you dream you're a millionaire, you have all these positive. He's like, negative fantasies? Like, what a waste of mental effort. Think about that.
It's so true. And most of them never come to pass.
That's exactly right.
Right? So when looking back, sometimes you have to live a little while before you realize that's true. And you think about all the negative fantasies you've ever had and what an incredible waste of energy it's been, and how you really, it was self-torture for nothing.
It's the bane of human existence.
It is insanity.
So I wanted to throw in a couple of quick things here. I wanted to talk about obstacles that the mystery schools had faced. I'm going to do a quick jump to theosophy and some unusual obstacles that they ran into early on. And one of them had to do with these people that would show up at Blavatsky's place of residence and do unusual things like strange activity, poltergeist style activity, manifestation. And then sometimes, they would almost appear to be apparitions themselves. So I'm just going to recount this story while I'm thinking of it. And again, that's Blavatsky and Alcott founding the Theosophical Society in 1875, and really giving us a head start on all of this. Now, this is from Alcott's Old Diary Leaves, which is such an incredible series of books about his experience. They're little diaries about spending time with Blavatsky and all the weird things that happened to them when they were building the society. And I can't even tell you the effect of reading those books. It's so unusual. But they're just, he's just recounting these extraordinary things, but it's quite a life that Alcott has. I think I've mentioned before that Alcott was on the board that was studying the assassination of President Lincoln. So there he was on basically the version of the Warren Commission that they had on Lincoln's assassination. And he was a colonel, in the Civil War. So he shows up in the 1870s, he's retired, and he's writing all of these interesting spiritualist, I went to this seance, I went to this, I did this, for the New York Times. So here he is talking about one of the weird experiences they had when Blavatsky founded Theosophy. Let's see if we can follow him here. Mention has been made of one Signor B, an Italian artist possessed of occult powers, who visited H.B. Blavatsky in New York. I witnessed one autumn evening in 1875, just after the Theosophical Society was formed, the extraordinary phenomena of rain-making effected by him, as he said, by the control of spirits of the air. The moon was at the full and not a cloud floated. In the clear blue sky, he called Blavatsky and myself out onto the balcony of her back drawing room, and bidding me keep perfectly silent and cool, whatever might happen, he drew from the breast of his coat and held up towards the moon a pasteboard card, perhaps 6 by 10 inches in size, upon one face of which were painted in watercolors a number of squares, each containing a strange mathematical figure, but which he would not let me handle nor examine. I stood close behind him, and I could feel his body stiffen as though he were responding to an intense concentration of will. Presently, he pointed at the moon, and we saw dense black vapors like thunderclouds. I should rather say like tumbling mass of black smoke that streams away from the funnel of a moving steamer, pouring out of the shining eastern rim of the brilliant satellite and floating away towards the horizon. Involuntarily, I uttered an exclamation, but the sorcerer gripped my arm with a clutch of steel and motioned me to be silent. More and more rapidly, the black pall of a cloud rushed out, and the longer and longer it stretched away towards the distance, like a monstrous jetty plume of smoke. It spread into a fan shape, and soon other dark rain clouds appeared in the sky, now here, now there, and formed into masses rolling, drifting, and scudding, exactly like a natural watery meteor. Rapidly, the heavens became overcast. When we came into the light of the chandelier, I saw that his face had the look of an iron firmness, clenching of the teeth that one sees on the faces of comrades in battle. And truly, for good reason, for he had just been battling against and conquering the unseen hosts of the elements, a thing that brings out every spark of virile force in a man.
Barrel force.
Senor B, right. Senor B did not linger with us, but hastily took his leave, and as the hour was late, I followed his example. Within the next few minutes, the pavement was wet with rain, the air damp and cool. My rooms were but a few steps off, and I had barely reached them. And I settled myself for a smoke when the bell rang, and upon opening the front door, I found Senor B. Pale and partly exhausted, he excused himself for troubling me, but asked for a glass of water. I made him enter, and after he had drunk the water and rested a while, we went to conversing about occult subjects and kept it up for a long time. I found him ready to talk about art, literature, science, but extremely reticent about occult science and his personal experience in psychic development. He explained, however, that all the races of elemental spirits are controllable by man with his innate divine potencies are developed, his will then becoming an irresistible force through which all inferior, that is, every elemental force. And so he goes on. I had originally seen him on the best of terms with Blavatsky, talking in the most friendly and unreserved manner about Italy, Garibaldi, Mazzini, the Eastern and Western adepts, etc., and matching phenomena like the trick of the white butterflies. And I certainly had no reason to be amazed. I certainly had reason to be amazed when, putting on an air of mystery, he warned me right then to break off my intimacy with her. He said she was a very wicked and dangerous woman. And I think Alcott, again, his intimacy, they're partners in the Theosophical Society. It's not a love relationship. He said she was a very wicked and dangerous woman and would bring some terrible calamity upon me if I allowed myself to fall under her malign spell. This, he said, he was ordered by the great master whose name I had heard him pronounce to Blavatsky to tell me. I looked at the man to see if I could detect the concealed meaning of this preposterous speech. Finally, I said, well, senor, I know that the personage you mention exists. I have every reason, after seeing your phenomena, to suspect that you have relationships with him or with the mystery schools. I'm ready even to sacrifice of my life to obey his behests. And now I demand that you give me a certain sign by which I shall know positively and without room for the least doubt that Madame Blavatsky is the devil that you depict, and that the master's will is that my acquaintance with her shall cease. Senor B hesitated, stammered out something incoherent, and turned the conversation. Though he could draw inky clouds out of the moon, he could not throw black doubt into my heart about my friend and guide through the mazy intricacies of occult science, Helena Blavatsky. The next time I saw Blavatsky, I told her about B's warning, whereupon she smiled, said I had nicely passed through this test, and wrote a note to Senor B to forget the way to her door, which he did. So,
wow.
Again, the attempt to frustrate the founding of these schools, even taking on this elaborate. Now, Senor B, when he comes in with these cards, he's using a mathematical formula somehow to conjure weather phenomena. Think about that. That's 1875. And one thing that we know about Alcott is he's, kind of consistently honest about all sorts of things in relation to the founding of Theosophy. So what are we to make of this bit of interference? To me, it's like the Gurdjieff plane crash of the senator who was helping him, or Raj dying. It's a series of obstacles whenever this thing gets going. And of course, we have Bennett founding this great Sherborne house, and he gets earlier on, he's completely thrown off the track by Idries Shah, who takes the school that he developed in Coombe Springs and makes it into, has him sign it over and says, I'm the new Gurdjieff, has him sign it over. And then his first rule that he makes is that Bennett's not allowed on the property. And then he basically makes it into condos. There are these people thrown to keep this process off track, especially when it gets to America. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, deep here on the Mystery Schools. Tonight, we're going to be taking a few more of your questions. So great to have so many of you here with us tonight. It's great to see familiar faces out there. And I want to remind you, by the way, to go to darkjournalist.com sign up for our newsletter there. That keeps us in touch, and we get around the incredible censorship that we've been witnessing, which is, without precedent. We've never seen it as bad as it is right now. And, this little Twitter wave notwithstanding, I don't know what they're going to do with that nonsense. But in any case, the newsletter provides for us to have that really kind of remarkable back and forth. It's a free newsletter, and basically you're going to learn about the remarkable interviews that we have coming up for you in the rest of November, including this John F. Kennedy special that we're doing for the 59th anniversary. I want to tell you more about that. Catherine Austin Fitz coming on the program later. I see Dr. Joseph Farrell out there. We're going to have him come back on. He's been working really hard on a new book, and just incredible interviews we have lined up, including something special. We'll have Gigi Young back, and just incredible people, documentaries, and X series episodes coming up for you throughout the rest of the year. That's what you need that newsletter for, to make sure you're up to date on all that, especially with all the weirdness that they're doing on YT. Yes.
Okay. Jimmy Kennemer. Are the Masons a right-hand mystery school? And Jordan Banner, would the Rosicrucians be a lesser group?
No. I think the Rosicrucians are the main Western initiatory group. The Rudolf Steiner tradition comes out of that Rosicrucian tradition. There's no question for me. And he was certainly initiated under the Rosicrucian Western initiator piece. That's where his master came out of the shadows to enlighten him. But on the Mason side, there's no real answer because it's so splintered. It certainly would be, but we have this Masonic piece running on so many different sides with so many different incidents along the way that it's impossible the way that they have it laid out there now, because you have a long-standing tradition of an organization, and then you have a deeper history of its founding and its implications and the kind of deep esoteric truths that they hold there. But does the process get corrupted in different venues that use the same term of Mason? See, this is tricky. So it's very hard to say. I don't think that you could say that the Masons would be one or the other. It depends on who you're talking about. But fundamentally, they would be. Yes. What do you got?
Ray Story, does physical wealth deter from spiritual advancement? Rich folks seldom seem at peace or truly happy to me.
Well, we've seen that too. I mean, they've been having these incredible billion-dollar lotteries, and so many would love to get their hands on $1 billion, I guess. And I think lotteries are fun, and I'll play them. I certainly, I like to try my luck on those things. But I will say this, really, somebody, if you got $1 billion, I mean, it takes a very strong individual to handle that properly. So I always say that you get just as much as you need in life. And actually, the less that you carry in relation to that, the better, as long as you can get things done. And I believe that we mentioned Catherine Ponder earlier. I think there is a kind of financial magic for things when you're trying to put something together. And I think that you can attract it if you need to for a good purpose. And some people handle money real well, but I will say that most get, hung up on it. But, it's funny when you think about bringing the work of Gurdjieff over to America. Well, who was really deeply into that? It was Mary Mellon, right? So when we go back there into the record, some of those really well-founded groups, they also were involved. The Mellons were deeply involved with bringing Young over to America. So it depends. It all depends on who's driving the vehicle. But wow, That's a good question. Yes.
Starseed, is it possible to
I have nothing against money.
Actually, you know what? I'm going to comment on that because I've done a lot of work on this
Yes.
personally. Is that the real? I'm very opinionated about this. The real problem with the Earth plane, more than anything else, is that all the wrong people have the money.
Oh, it's upside down. Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah, it's
It is.
inverted.
Yeah.
So there are beautiful people with a lot of heart, and they're broke, and they don't know how to. They're trying to manifest like crazy, and they would do beautiful things with the money. I am certain, and I wonder why it is that way. But for people like that, it is actually, sometimes there are ideas that we have to overcome, sometimes from this lifetime, sometimes from past lives. We've been programmed with the idea that money is evil or it'll corrupt us, and we push it away. And we do need to overcome that because if God is one thing, God is limitless, prosperous. Like there's no, look at all the species, look at all the stars, right? There's no, if we are made in God's image, if we are experiencing any lack, that we are manifesting that because of we're not living up to our true potential.
Oh, there's a lot of, there's a lot of incredible stories. I remember that, there's an incredible story about how Gurdjieff got the priory, in fact, because they didn't have enough money to do it. I think back then they had something, the priory is this wonderful building with all this land on it in France. And he wants to found his institute there. And he's sending in one of his pupils and he says, make the offer of, I'll just guess and say $10,000. And she's saying, well, they want 75,000, like you can't get it for 10. And he said, just make it and keep imagining that she says yes. And she goes in and makes the offer and they get the priory. Now there's probably a deeper thing involved because many good things happened as a result of that. There's all kinds of money stuff involved with Casey's work as well, including the fact of these stockbrokers funding him and getting all this Wall Street tips and things from him. And then finally saying, you know what, we don't want you to, do readings for anyone else. We need you on a call 24/7 doing this stuff. And like, forget about these medical readings. And he says no. And they're like, oh yeah, well, we're pulling all the money out for that hospital. You can't build that hospital now. That belongs to us. And the house you live in, we're taking you to court to get it back. And these are people who've been his friends for years. So think about money and how we handle it. And you can tell a lot about a person's character by the way that they handle money. And someone who is, not generous with money, it reveals a great deal about who they are. And then someone who's a doormat who gives all their money away, that's also a problem. But certainly I think when it comes to money, we shouldn't worry so much about it, and that it's there for us. And, I was talking to someone who had written to me and they gave me a list of these different things. And they said, I still support your show, but I've canceled this and this and this and this because, I want to get through all of this stuff that's going on and all the rest of it. And I said, well, you have to do what like you have to put your money where you think your money is important. But I suggested the idea that, the idea of like saving $60 or $100 a year and not supporting something that's worthwhile for people who are on the ground and helping to change the situation doesn't make any sense. So people who think, well, I'm going to put my money away, because of all these things that are going on. No, that's not it. There's actually a line in the New Testament that always stuck with me, which was, there's a lot of lack of faith in that, I would say. And I remember the line that Jesus gives to somebody. He says, look, there'll come a time when the person who seeks to preserve their life will lose it because, it's coming from this place of lack. And there's a famous scene where the rich man comes up to Jesus in the New Testament and he says, tell me what I need to do. And he says, drop all your holdings, basically give it away and follow me. And he said, I can't do that. My father built up the vineyards and all this stuff. And he says, well, choose who you're going to serve, God or money. What are you going to do? And so the guy keeps the vineyards and all that stuff. And, one of the disciples says to Jesus, what happened with him? And Jesus said, nothing. It's going to be harder for, it'll be easier for the camel to get through the eye of the needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. And it doesn't mean that money is bad or anything, but it's that type of attachment. And, I think there's a great lesson, I would say, in these things. Of course, King Solomon, with all of his money, did great stuff, right? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here on X Series 139. Whew, going deep with your questions. And you're asking good questions there in the ideas room tonight. More questions, Miss Olivia.
Okay, Trident Vibes. What was the aim of Gurdjieff's work? To use the force, as it were, to get out of this? I think it was. Actually, let me clarify for a second. So, in the cosmology, why are we here? What is the purpose of life? And therefore, why do we apply ourselves with directed effort? Are we trying to escape the Earth plane?
I would hope no. I don't want to escape the Earth plane. I think that you want to basically meet the test of the Earth plane, and the Greeks thing with JFK would quote, which is, "I want to live my life exercising my powers along the lines of excellence." And so you want to utilize those talents, those God-given talents that you have. So this is a big question, but to go back to the Gurdjieff side of that question, which is what was he trying to do? Because we're not Gurdjieff, right? But what Gurdjieff was trying to do was, according to him, was bring his system of harmonious development out to humanity so that they would have these tools. What I see is the mystery schools who had tried through Theosophy, who had tried through Steiner, who were trying through Casey, taking somebody else under their wing and saying, you know what, you're kind of a maverick. I'll tell you what, here's the system, and you go out and, try to fly with this and see how humanity picks up on it, and use a lot of different techniques and, experiment, basically, because there's something about Gurdjieff's work which is so innovative, so different, but he seems like somebody who's very brave, and he's trying different things, and he's always getting results, different types of results to compare with. So he's almost scientific in the way that he's doing these things. I would say that he's there to provide a balance to the Western, complete embrace of the scientific materialism, and giving them what he called esoteric Christianity, which is Western, but it's like a Western Christianity that is infused with Eastern knowledge. And it's the balance of the two, I think, that really wins the day at the end of the day. I wanted to bring out something odd that Ouspensky put out there. And this isn't one that I think it's one for us to ponder. But when I was thinking about Biden and some of these other people that they were talking about, and even like Fetterman and people like that, I started to wonder to myself, these people seem very vacant. And what is it about the leaders that we're getting that seem like they're these vacant vehicles? We'll try some of these questions from the Fourth Way books about recurrence and essence from P.D. Ouspensky. And Ouspensky, again, we've talked about so many people around the Gurdjieff work. Ouspensky basically writing the cornerstone book on Gurdjieff's work, In Search of the Miraculous. All right, here's the question that he got. Is it possible for great people in historical movements to escape from life? Now, Ouspensky believes in recurrence, that when we leave this life, we go right back to the beginning of it and we live through it again. And that we do this over and over again. and he studied something called the laws of Manu in Indian literature that convinced him this was true. So let's just get a little pinch of this. In most cases, it is too late for them to escape. They are dead already. They are almost losing their bones on the way, but they have to continue to exist and turn around. That is one of the mysteries of life that is governed by dead people. In most cases, next question. I do not see why big historical figures are so important that they must continue to recur even when they become dead. Why wouldn't it be easy to find substitutes for them? Easy for whom? Evidently, they fit into some condition and so continue to go around in the same way. Even if they die, people take them for living beings. Perhaps it is their chief feature that they are dead, for they cannot make a mistake. They do exactly the same things as leaders over and over again. You speak of dead people recurring, but I thought essence could not die. And then he gives an explanation for this. Then this question. In thinking about life, we forget that many people are dead and that sleeping people easily can fall under the influence of dead people. Wow. Question. Are most people dead? Answer. This question was much discussed in our group in St. Petersburg. That's the Gurdjieff group. Some thought that most people were dead, but I always was against this. Everybody is asleep, but even in life, you find pleasant people who may not work through laziness, lack of opportunity, or something else, but they're not dead. How can dead people influence sleeping people? In comparison with sleeping people, they're very strong because they have no conscience and no shame. What makes ordinary people weak? Conscience and shame. Besides, if people are asleep, anything can happen to them. They can be stolen out of their beds. All people in life are asleep, but not all are dead. Yet at the same time, if one cannot accept and use B influence at all, that refers to something in the system, there's nothing to keep one from dying sooner or later. So what he's saying is he's kind of doing the big jump, which is if people are recurring, then the ones that are so far gone that when they recur, they just don't have any essence of soul left. So they are just vehicles for any kind of evil. But the thing is that when they are like that, if the other people who are recurring are going through their lives in a kind of sleepy, dazed fashion, they become victims of these people because of the difference in conscience, because those people are no longer awake to their conscience because they're dead. And so if they're powerful people who rise to these positions, this is taking the theory of eternal recurrence under consideration, then we're talking about dead people ruling other people who are alive but asleep. Okay, that's that's how Ouspensky rolls.
Everybody is talking about NPCs about this, but also Stephen Huey brings up body snatchers. So if somebody is dead, can you have a walk-in of some kind? Can some inhabiting spirit occupy those, quote, dead people who are powerful?
It's really interesting. There's no question. I mean, we've seen it already with people who get this is kind of into Steiner territory, because he says that when Ahriman comes through, if humanity is not awake, if they're in a drowsy state when they confront him, then the entire evolutionary path of humanity gets thrown off. So therefore, when we encounter people who are on that level, how many people who are sucked into virtual reality or, already experiencing that separation of their minds from their bodies through addiction to technology or whatever, they become vessels for something else that can enter the more that they have vacated. And I think that's what he's getting at here. But I think it goes deep on recurrence when you think about it, because the idea of recurrence is like deja vu. You have an experience, you're like, I feel like I've seen that person before. I know what they're going to say before they say it. Now, here's a twist on that. and eternal recurrence shows up in Nietzsche, but the esoteric fashion of it is Ouspensky's work. A twist on that is, in a reading, they asked Casey, at what point does our awareness take in events that are actually happening? And he says, some minds process events that are happening, and it takes 20 years for them to process. So these things have already taken place. So your mind is already just processing things that have happened. That's interesting because, again, that would provide also a kind of deja vu feeling. In Theosophy, they say there's 3 types of dreams. One type of dream is just you sorting through the psychological aspects of your daily life. The second part of dreaming is based on your environment, a loud noise, what you ate the night before. But the third part is outside of time and space. So it's you on the astral plane. You don't, there is no time, there is no space. And so in that no time, no space, that's why you can have futuristic dreams. That's why so-and-so is going to call you tomorrow through that dream, or I saw so-and-so in the dream, because that part of the dreaming cycle isn't subject to time. So you're already there and doing it. So, there are levels and pieces of this that have been left behind for us to explore, and we still have a long way to go. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Redcap Goblin, tons of Mandela folks claiming close relatives literally became strangers overnight, spouses changing, etc., gaining or losing extended family too.
Oh, wow. I've heard interesting stories about that. What about the stories about people who just show up who are from different time periods, There's an interesting, we have like interdimensional pieces with this, right? And then we also have the life after death piece with this. And so, in the Casey work, you find that in his life, he often, when he worked with someone psychically, when they would pass away, they would manifest to him and he would continue to give them help. So that's the level that he was on. And it's interesting because his own father died, and the father lived with them because he was on rough circumstances. And Hugh Lynn Casey recounts a story in his book about hearing someone upstairs in the office of his grandfather, Casey's father. And Casey says, don't, that's just him up there looking through his papers and stuff. And Hugh Lynn Casey is actually very skeptical of all of his dad's stuff. And he's like, what do you mean? You mean the grandfather's ghost is up there? And Casey's like, he's just up there, like sorting through his stuff. Leave him alone, And Hugh and Casey's like, no, I'm going to find out what's up there. And he charges up the stairs and he opens the door to this attic office room. And he said, I ran into something. It felt like cobwebs or like spider webs. It was just all over me. And I had the impression of like interrupting and somebody being very angry at me. And he said, I ran out of the house. I was terrified. And like, as I ran out of the house, Casey's looking at him like, well, you should have listened, So, it's different levels of comprehension. And certainly we're in a period of time when the other dimensional aspects, being aware of life after death, being aware of psychic experience, reincarnation, these other different pieces are becoming part of our soul faculties. Like the awareness level is going up. Think about 300 years ago, if Theosophy comes in 150 years ago, a lot of these concepts aren't even on people's minds at all. I've mentioned this about yoga before. Everywhere you go, you see people dragging a yoga mat around. How much of that was going on in the 19th century, So there are changes that are coming through there, and it is rather dramatic. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X-139, deep on the mystery schools in America. We've gone into the difficulties of founding the fourth way mystery in America. We have a couple more questions we'll take, and then we're going to sign off. Great to have so many of you with us here. And wow, what a terrific night. Yes.
We've gone into a detour that is really interesting. So as far as recurrence goes,
Yes.
do you, I know for me, this was a hard thing to wrap my head around, but now that I've lived a while, I have to say my life does not feel like it should. Like I literally look around and I go, where it should be different, like almost like a memory, like where is my house? Where are my friends? Where is my life? You know,
Interesting.
there's a void. All these things are not there, as if they're not drawn in. The illustration is left blank. And
well, this is interesting because I remember I've had dreams of people who seem like they were real people in reality, and then you wake up and you're like, oh, it was just a dream. But you seem to have some memory of them. At least I did. And I think that in the recurrence literature, in The Strange Life of Ivan Ossikin, he has experiences like that, where he feels like, oh, someone is missing from the recurrence, and he can tell. The Laws of Manu piece that he draws from in New Model of the Universe, there's a whole piece on recurrence, which I recommend. And New Model of the Universe is such a fantastic and very ahead of its time book that Ouspensky wrote. But when he's talking about it, he says that the laws of Manu say that you go through the cycles of these different lives, and then at the point you become aware of it, you advance, And so if you've advanced spiritually, you move on to some kind of other different lives. This is a little different than reincarnation. But recurrence, if you are going through your lives and you're not very aware, you're going to keep going through those lives until they wake you up, basically. So you'll wake up in exactly the same circumstances, but someone else in there may have already moved on. They may have, so they're not in the recurrence with you, and you're like, where is that person? So that's what I got from that. But
everybody's agreeing with me. They're all saying that life doesn't feel right.
Not since 2016.
Probably. Well, there's that idea that we all died in 2012, and are we in the 8th sphere or something?
We've
are we
all
in a different
shifted
timeline?
For sure.
Yeah, it does. It certainly doesn't feel right at all.
Well, isn't that that's almost like a global spell, right? And we've seen a lot of this. There are some very unusual forces in charge of the world right now, and that does not feel right. The elections don't feel
okay.
Right.
Well, let's get into it. All right, if they are occultists, okay,
yes,
did they do a global spell? And
yes,
and did we miss it somehow? And can we now catch on looking back? And somehow can we untangle it? Can we wake ourselves up from it and cancel the spell? This is the actual question we should be asking.
I agree 100%. Whoa.
Any answers?
Olivia's got it. No, I like the question. All
right, everybody in the comments section, if you've got ideas, let us know.
Absolutely.
We've got to
the ideas room, they can handle this question. That's what I love about the ideas room. All right, let's see. Is there anything I left out here? I'm sure there's so much. This is P.L. Travers, who wrote Mary Poppins, and gave us this very incredible book series that apparently was heavily influenced by Gurdjieff somehow. And she certainly had a remarkable life. She apparently was very close with Oraj's wife, which is how she got involved with Gurdjieff.
Are you going to go into that a little bit?
Well, there's no way to know. This is the thing. It's hard. Her personal life she's made a mystery on purpose, as well as also, kind of intentionally flouting dates, flouting what her dad did for a living, flouting certain incidents in her childhood. There's a lot of very strange things about her. She'd probably make a good show all on her own, frankly. But I think that it is interesting that Disney was so intent on getting Mary Poppins, and that she was not happy with the version that they made ultimately. I found that really interesting. and also the fact that all through her life, she's doing this very kind of Zen path with Gurdjieff work, and ends up writing a book on Gurdjieff. These are the things that you realize the essence of the Fourth Way School and Gurdjieff's teaching influenced a lot of people. And, Ida Rolf, Rolfing we get from one of the main Gurdjieff students. And, there's just a series of different things that come directly out of that. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Hold on.
You got it.
Okay. Jordan Banner, where are we going in terms of the future? Where did these individuals see us moving towards?
Well, I think they're giving us options and tools. And I think someone like, J.G. Bennett, he's giving us his idea of how this is going to go. But certainly, on the Gurdjieff level, he's letting that system through. He knows what his job is there. And, we have to always remember there's always going to be kind of mysteries and scandals around these people because they're human and they're not perfect by a long shot, but they are bringing forward things that can change the culture. And I think what they are looking at is building a new world. This is what is coming out of the Casey work, coming out of the Steiner's work, which is that whole idea about a sixth root race. It literally just means that we're moving up to a place where our spiritual side is more fully recognized in our physical lives, and we become more evolved as a result of that. The problem is, at least from the Steiner cosmology, and the others kind of suggest the same problem in different ways, but that the harmonic powers are so intent on knocking us off of that natural evolutionary track that they now have an incredible tool of global domination through the technology to do that. And that's why I think all this work, which was not available, in earlier eras, is available there for us to find the truth, do battle with that inhuman wave, and to expand our own spiritual awareness. I think that is what it's all about. And let's face it, so many people have been under the influence of pharmaceuticals, propaganda, entrainment, political brainwashing. This is what they're doing with people. Those people are living and dying under those scenarios. So we have a situation in the world which has been upside down, but now becomes really obvious to a great deal of people because that level on the top is reaching a more and more psychopathic crescendo. And so this is the nature of the situation we find ourselves in. So for me, the mystery school information is brought forward to give us the tools to survive and thrive in that environment. And with that, Miss Olivia.
Hold on. I just want to say everybody's answer to the question
Yes.
pretty much was CERN.
Oh, interesting. Oh, I can definitely see that. I absolutely agree.
Obviously, we need to follow this up with another episode specifically about this. And if that is, that if it is a combination of technology and spiritual warfare, occult warfare, then it seems to me that the only way to truly fight it, the thing is, they've atomized us, right? Everybody is pretty much alone. There's loneliness abounds, right? Everywhere. And they didn't want us getting together, right? They didn't want us gathering.
Oh, think about that. Yeah.
So I keep thinking about Dorothy behind you, and There's No Place Like Home, right? She needed a technique to bring herself out of her spell, right? With the ruby slippers and stuff. We need the same thing, but I think, and certainly we can do that individually, but we seem to collectively need each other to help awaken each other, get out of the spell, and manifest a better reality for all of us and a better earth.
There's no question. I agree with that 100%. I'm going to read P.L. Travers' quote about Gurdjieff here. We'll close with this since she showed up a couple of times in interesting ways. It is clear from Gurdjieff's writings that hypnotism, mesmerism, and various arcane methods of expanding consciousness have played a large part in the studies of the seekers of truth, a group Gurdjieff said he belonged to in his youth. None of these processes, however, is to be thought of as having any bearing on what is called black magic. And according to Gurdjieff, has always one definite characteristic. It is the tendency to use people for some, even the best of aims, without their knowledge and understanding, either by producing in them faith and infatuation or by acting upon them through fear. There is, in fact, neither red, green, or yellow magic. There is only doing. Only doing is magic. Great quote from Travers, and in the right context, I think we get a great deal from it. And with that, Miss Olivia.
Okay, I got a bunch of people to thank.
Here.
Okay, so Gillenjoy R, a cult fan, Erica Swenson Elliott, Slow Time, Jordan Banner, Karen Carpenter, Edward Menz, Rizdan, Redcap Goblin, Bob Bindert, Doreen Hewitt, Kat DF, Floor A, Jim Sarge 3ID, Jason May, Global Atlantis, Robert Scott, Calvin Center, Under Destroyer, Jordan Romeau, John Folden, Jimmy Kennemer, Starseed, Trident Vibes, Thomasine Richards, David Gilker, Eurythmia's Fun, and Doyle Wayne. Thank you so much for your generous super chats. We really appreciate it.
Fantastic. Wow. Incredible support. Thank you so much. And, to all of our supporters and all our subscribers, we really appreciate it. It helps us to do the reports here for you. We will be back next week. We have some fascinating work coming up, including a John F. Kennedy special on the 59th anniversary of his assassination, and the government's still holding the records. There's a lot of new things I want to bring forward in that one, so remember to join us for that. We will see you next Friday, and maybe there'll be some interesting reports between now and then as well. Also, the Fourth Way piece we'll pick up on for sure in an upcoming X series episode. Great stuff coming up. Remember to go to darkjournalist.com, especially if you're new, sign up for the newsletter and make sure that you're getting that on a regular basis. Lets you know when the shows are coming up and, the incredible things that we have for you, and gets us around the censorship that we've been seeing. If you are enjoying the show, feel free to support the show and become a subscriber at Dark Journalist. We've made that easy enough for you, and we have some special things coming up in the new year for subscribers as well as events. And so I think that's it. I'll do a couple of shout outs here. Auntie Queenie, that's a great name right there. Najat, thank you. It's great to see you. Elaine Morgan, wow. Redcap Goblin, Scott, New York City. And by the way, bravo, Miss Olivia. Unbelievable. Great commentary and great, really fantastic questions there from the ideas room. Let's see. Hey, I like that. David, how are you, sir? Ray's story. What is that? Maybe I'll know the Senate election final results by then. Exactly.
There was a comment I wanted to share.
Yes.
Plato Always Knew says, Miss Olivia, can you ask DJ what year he plans to run for president, and will you be on that ticket as vice?
Oh, well, you'd be fantastic.
I don't know about that.
Unbelievable. You can run anything. We've seen that.
But we have been talking. I mean, Fetterman shows anything's possible.
That's it. Fetterman did it. This is what happens. Everyone's going to look at Fetterman and be like, I'm going for U.S. Senator. I got to be better than that. Jesus. Let's see. Same DJ time, same DJ channel. Exactly. Let's see. Lucy Rain, Sol Lee, John Guilfoyle, Keith Leitzer. I don't get to catch... What is that? Thank you, DJ and Olivia. I don't get to catch a live show often. It's been a treat. Great info. Thank you. I really appreciate you joining us, actually. It's great to have you. Fantastic people out there tonight. Joseph, fantastic to see you, sir. I hope to talk to you soon. And Kate, if you're watching, I know I just saw you up there. It's great to see you. You two are a shining gem. in the dark time, a conduit for light, if you will. Well, that's how I feel about the Ideas Room, actually. Great impressions from all of you out there, giving us that incredible feedback. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Love and light, they say. Stephen Yu. I'm probably going to do a show just on the Enneagram, by the way, because I had more to say about that one. Didn't get to it tonight, but we will. Daniel, do you feel like you have spirit guides helping you with your work? Well, there's something. There's definitely something, let me tell you. Somebody up there likes me. I'll put it that way. You'd be better than Kamala. So that's great. Modwiz out there. It was a good night. It's good to see you, sir. Let's see. Jennifer, great to see you. Great show. Fantastic. Everyone, we will see you all next week. Have a fantastic weekend. And to all the veterans out there,
Yes.
I salute you for your service. Of course, my dad was a veteran, and he, learned a great deal by being in the military. And I've always found that there's a great discipline to the military, and so I have a great respect for the institution. And he said thank you to somebody, Miss Olivia. Trident vibes never really ends. Exactly. He got the line before I got there. That's good. Now we're talking. Let's see. Good night, all. Like a Vincognito, Lucy Rain, Shamnas Anamkara, chorus. Great to see you. We will see you all next week. And remember, it says end broadcast, but as we know,
Never really ends.
And never let it be forgot. Once there was Camelot. Can't get better than that. Miss Olivia, final words?
Oldest Dirt said, I believe that JFK in a speech said there was no room for secret societies in the USA.
Isn't that interesting? Well, I think the type that he was talking about, I don't blame him. And the very word secrecy is repugnant, as he put it. And, I couldn't have put it any better myself. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Well, that's putting it real. How often do we think like that? Gee, we really could use JFK, no question, in this period of time. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you all next week. Have a great night.
Okay. God bless.